The four monsters regrouped, growling low in their throats as they did so. Jonathan shook his head, and advanced, feeling weaker with every step. The monsters weren't in much better shape either, but the injuries that he had inflicted on them were all in non-vital places, as opposed to his wrist wounds. One of the monsters broke formation to snap at him, and he quickly snatched its front paws out of the air, flipping it upside down, and using his redirection skill as he did so. He swung with all of his might on top of the skill's effect, and when the monster struck the ground, it did so with bone-breaking force. With a brutal strike, Jonathan broke its spine, killing the creature. The other three were already upon him however, and it was too late for him to repeat the same maneuver. He went down beneath the snapping jaws of the monsters, and he felt them tear deeper into his skin and bone as they assaulted him. He lashed out with his gauntlets, feeling bones breaking and the sizzling of flesh as his reward. However, he was unable to fully dislodge the monsters, and they continued to injure him as they attacked. Finally, he was able to kill one of the monsters, and he was left with only two to deal with. That would have been within his capabilities before, but now he was far weaker than he had been at the start of the fight. He snatched at the air, grabbing one of the monster's throats by sheer luck. He clenched his fist as tightly as he could, and he was rewarded with the feeling of a collapsing windpipe under his hand. Finally, there was only one monster left. This one was the strongest of the lot, and it was able to overpower Jonathan, forcing him into the ground. He punched at his stomach with his failing strength, unable to get it off him. With a final surge of energy, he pressed his hands together, and summoned more mana than he had ever before, breathing a soccer ball-sized orb of light. The attack burned through the thing's stomach like an axe through human skin, and it recoiled, howling in pain. Jonathan stumbled to his feet, and finished the monster off with a blow from his right hand. As the essence entered his body, he collapsed, completely spent. "Oi, Jonas! He's getting up." A reedy voice came from somewhere behind Jonathan's head, and he jolted awake. He was sitting in a cart, one with bars on its windows and a lock on the door. He was surrounded with other lost souls, each of whom looked dejected. Behind him was a scrawny rat of a man, missing most of his teeth. He was the one who had remarked on his awakening. "Where am I? Am I a prisoner?" Jonathan asked the man, confused as to what had happened. He had just been fighting those ash prowlers, before he had collapsed. A few notifications were waiting for him, but he ignored them. He had healed, which meant that he had gained at least one level for his troubles. "You don't know. You were captured by slavers, just like the rest of us. Yours is a life of pain and misery now, just like ours," the man replied. "Anyway, let's not dwell on that. I'm Danny, and this here is Jonas." He pointed to a small doll lying on the floor. It was a uniquely ugly creation, made out of matted straw and what looked like human sinew. Jonathan frowned, and gave the man a look. "You mean that doll?" "Shoo. Jonas doesn't like it when people call him a doll," Danny replied. Jonathan sighed. The man was clearly insane. The other prisoners ignored his prattle completely, and Jonathan soon followed them. However, it seemed that Danny would not be satisfied by that. "So, where do you come from?" he asked Jonathan. When Jonathan did not answer, he prodded him with his hand. It was meant to jostle Jonathan, but he didn't move an inch. Danny gasped. "Damn, you're like a rock. What level are you? What level are you?" Jonathan asked in turn. He would not give out any information to any of these people, let alone Danny. "Level 4. I managed to kill a few monsters before the slavers picked me up." "What about you though?" "Higher than that." As Jonathan looked around the carriage, he scanned the other prisoners. They were all incredibly low level. A spark of hope surged within Jonathan's chest as he realized that this carriage was likely made for the weak, and would not hold up to him. He got to his feet, noticing that his armor was missing, and walked over to the bars. They were quite thin, but still too strong for any normal human to bend. However, Jonathan was far from normal. He took a firm grip of the bars with each hand, and began to pull. Laughter erupted behind him, but it quickly turned to shocked silence as the metal warped underneath his hands. With a rage-fueled jolt, he tore the bars out of the brittle wood underneath. A blaring alarm started up, and he walked out of the carriage. There were a dozen other carriages arranged in a neat line, traversing the ash. The one that he had been in was part of a convoy, and it seemed to be filled entirely with slaves and their guards. Every 2 carriages, 2 guards rode on strangely mutated horses. As soon as they saw Jonathan escaping, the nearest ones whirled around and charged at him. "Stop right now!" one of them bellowed, his voice stern. Rather than run, Jonathan held his ground. He would not leave this place without freeing the other slaves. He had come here to destroy the hells, not contribute to their injustice. As the guard neared him, with no intention of stopping, Jonathan twisted to the side and grabbed his lance. With a quick heave, he tore the man out of his saddle and sent him crashing into a nearby carriage. Smiling, he raced towards the other guard, leaping at the last moment. The guard swung their sword in slow motion, and Jonathan plucked it out of the air, clipping up and over it, unbalancing the guard. With a quick kick, he staved in the woman's head, killing her instantly. The guards were quite a bit weaker than him, but they were still both level 17. He was just an anomaly in the grand scheme of things. Some of the slaves were beginning to spill out of the carriage that Jonathan had left, and were starting to run. "Stop!" Jonathan called out, but they ignored him. A moment later, a guard skewered 2 of them on his lance. Jonathan roared in rage, and pushed his speed to its maximum, briefly moving at upwards of 100 miles per hour. He only moved at that speed for a few seconds, but it was enough. Before the guard could strike again, Jonathan crashed into his steed, knocking the horse off its feet. The guard crashed to the ground, and Jonathan was on top of him in an instant. He raised one fist and brought it crashing down, the light of mana suffusing his form. Gore splattered the ash as he splat the guard's head, and before the guard's partner could strike, he rolled forward, getting out of the way of an axe strike. Placing his hand on the ground, he pushed himself up into the air, leaping over the guard's head. He flipped around in the air, and drove his heel into the guard's head, killing him instantly. It had barely been 30 seconds, and 4 of the guards were already down. A moment later, pain tore through his right arm, and he looked down to see a gaping hole in it. A spike of energy had just passed straight through it. He looked around, and saw a robed man stepping out of one of the carriages towards the front of the convoy. He raised a staff, and sent another spike of energy towards Jonathan. Jonathan dodged and began to make his way towards the mage, zigzagging to avoid the attacks. Despite the other man's obvious power, his coordination was lacking, and he was unable to land a single strike on Jonathan. However, even as he reached the man, the mage did not seem perturbed. Jonathan punched forward with all of his might, aiming for the mage's head. A blue shield snapped into existence as soon as he punched, and his fist crashed into it, bouncing off. One of his knuckles cracked, and Jonathan roared in rage. "Not so confident now, are you, you filthy beast?" The mage scoffed, readying another attack. This one felt far more powerful to Jonathan, and he knew that he would not be able to get out of the way in time. Instead, he summoned his own mana, forcing it towards the burgeoning clump of energy. The mage's eyes widened as Jonathan's tendril of energy passed through his shield and pierced into his hand. There was a massive explosion that was thankfully contained by the shield, and as the dust cleared, all that Jonathan could see was a pool of blood where the man had been. A few notifications pulsed in the corner of his mind, but he pushed them aside for now. 10 more guards were charging towards him, ignoring the escaping slaves. The horse-like beasts that they rode slavered as they ran. Jonathan knew that he would not be able to defeat them all, but he had a different idea. Pointing his hand towards the horses, he expelled 100 points of mana outwards, sending a massive burst of blue flame towards the beast. If these creatures were anything like the horseback on Earth, this would be effective. Predictably, the monsters balked, and reared, throwing their riders off their backs. With the riders dismounted and dazed, it was child's play for Jonathan to kill them all. With that, the battle was over, and essence entered him, enough to push him up another level. In addition, he had gained a new skill. You have gained a new skill. Unravel Epic. Force your mana into the spellwork of another mage to unbind their spell. If your attack is successful, their skill will detonate. It was a simple anti-magic ability, albeit one with an offensive aspect. Judging by how paltry the mage's defenses had been, Jonathan guessed that they had simply leveled their intelligence and wisdom, rather than actually learning more about the mana that they wielded. However, there had been a strange energy imbued within the attacks of the mage, an energy that reminded him of metal. They had not been made out of pure mana, rather out of some sort of aspect energy. Jonathan sighed, and moved from carriage to carriage, breaking the bars on them and letting the slaves escape. As they ran off into the ash, he made his way towards the mage's carriage. Opening the door, he stepped inside, spotting his goods at the far end of the room. In addition, there was a good portion of money secreted around the room, that added up to a little bit over 100 Leviathan marks. Jonathan still had no idea what the currency was worth, but any was better than none. As soon as he put his armor back on and donned his gauntlets, he felt more comfortable. His armor was shredded and torn, but his gauntlets were untarnished. The armor would have to be replaced eventually, but he was hopeful that the gauntlets would last for a while. It seemed that within the same tier of power, there were different qualities of items. Jonathan quickly packed up his belongings and left the carriage, glad to see that all of the slaves had escaped. He had no wish to follow them. They would have to protect themselves on their own. He knew that he was being cruel and callous, but he had already saved them from their predicament, and he had more pressing matters to attend to, the most important of which was allocating all of the free points that he had accumulated. He quickly opened up his status sheet, having not done so in quite some time. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 1. Human, Basic. Outsider, Tier 1. Level 25. 60 free points. Strength. 99. Dexterity. 82. Constitution. 88. Resilience. 88. Intelligence. 89. Wisdom. 86. Divinity. 2. Health 880/880. Stamina 990/990. Mana 890/890. Titles. Chosen of Sarnathros, Unique. Nascent Divinity, Celestial. Righteous Killer, Rare. Underdog, Rare. Skills. Smite, Legendary. Unravel, Epic. Mana Drill, Rare. Focused Scry, Rare. Runes of Power, Rare. Redirect, Uncommon. Identify, Common. Pathway Skills. Martial Arts, Student 4. Mana Manipulation, Student 4. Runecrafting, Student 3. True Sight, Student 1. Quests. Hellbreaker, Impossible. Jonathan was almost at 100 points in strength, and before doing anything else, he was resolved to increase it to that level. He did not know why, but he had a strange, unexplainable urge to reach 100 points in the stat. He quickly invested 4 points into it, in batches of 2, and raised it to 105. A burning feeling started deep within his muscles, and it quickly ramped up in intensity, becoming a fiery agony deep within his body. Soon it grew beyond what he had the capability to bear, and he began to scream. His muscles melted within him, and reformed out of the ashes, stronger than ever before. The whole process had only lasted half a minute, but it had been a tortuous half-minute that had felt like an eternity. A notification appeared, and Jonathan quickly opened it, his eyes watering from the pain. You have passed the first threshold of strength. Strength is a concept that is known to all. It is physical might, and the ability to make the world bend to your desires. However, there are many forms of strength, not least of which is mental strength. For passing through the threshold, you have shown that you possess that latter strength in abundance. Jonathan felt far stronger than he had before, although the change was not reflected on his stat sheet. A few seconds later, a message appeared. Thresholds are qualitative increases in one's statistical strength, prompted by reaching 100 in a stat, and every order of magnitude after that. Passing a threshold in a stat makes that stat 1.5 times more efficient than before. No wonder he felt so powerful. As he perused his stat sheet, he realized that there had been one change. His stamina had increased to 1545, a marked increase. Jonathan still had the necessary stat points to reach the threshold in some of his other stats, but he put it aside for now. He had no wish to go through that pain again so soon, even with all of the power that it brought. He would have to do it soon enough anyway, as he leveled. Instead, he added 10 lots of 2 points to strength, bringing it up to 135. He immediately felt more powerful, and he punched the wall next to him, driving his fist deep into the wood. A smile rose unbidden to his face, and he laughed. He decided to save the remainder of the points for when he had crossed the next few thresholds in his other stats. It was just more efficient that way. However, the pulsing pain in his hand from where he had struck the wall reminded him that his resilience was lagging behind his strength. He added 9 points into it, taking out 6 points from his pool. The throbbing decreased, and he sighed in relief. That was a good thing to know for later. He could not let his physical stats drift too far from one another, or else he would weaken himself. Jonathan closed his interface and left the cart, wanting to get as far away from this place as he could. If these slavers had been part of a network, then they would be coming, looking for answers. Jonathan was ridiculously overpowered for his level, but he wasn't invincible. Far from it, however. If a large enough, or strong enough, army came looking for his head, there was little he could do about it. A twinge of sadness entered his mind as he saw the corpses of the slaves that he had failed to save. Each of them felt like a personal failure to him, even though he had tried to rescue them. Still, the majority of them had escaped, although he had no idea where they would go. He justified his abandonment of them by telling himself that it would be far more dangerous for them to have traveled with him. He wouldn't have been able to slow down his leveling speed to protect them, meaning that they would likely have died to the monsters. No, he had made the right decision. It did not mean that it made his feel especially good about it. Half an hour later, the caravan was far behind, and he was heading out into the seemingly endless expanse of ash that made up this circle of the infinite hells. He was yet to find another city, but he decided to follow the route that the caravan had been going. There had been little to no deviation in its trajectory for the duration of his short trip within the carriage, meaning that it was likely heading on a direct course to destination. Using his enhanced perception, he made sure that he was on the right course. A pack of ash prowlers came near him, but upon seeing him, they fled, knowing that he was far too strong for them to defeat. He was starting to exude an aura of power and danger around himself, one that would prove invaluable. Using the basic monsters to level up was useless now, and there was no reason for him to do anything other than ignore them. Seeing as they would ignore him now, it all worked out perfectly. A strange, fleshy shape jutted out of the ash in front of him, and he paused, reaching down to grab it. It was a hand, and it was still attached to a body. Pulling it out of the ash, he recognized the body. It was Danny, and the tiny doll lay on the ash next to him. The man had been savagely torn into by some monster with gargantuan claws, and his bottom half was barely holding on. Whatever had done this had done it for sport rather than necessity, seeing as none of his flesh was missing. Jonathan dropped the corpse and sighed. He really had no choice other than to investigate this, if only for the reason that whatever had done this was likely a match for him. As he thought this, a notification surfaced. You have gained a new quest. Reluctant Vengeance, B. The slaves that you freed are being picked off by a mysterious beast that you suspect is powerful enough to be a challenge for you. Follow the trail of corpses and find your target. Reward? The reward for the quest was simply a line of question marks, but seeing as he had been intending to follow that course of action anyway, he would settle for it. As he walked, he found more and more bodies, all having died in the same way. The bodies slowly grew warmer over time, and Jonathan quickly realized that the monsters had transported them, almost like a trail. There was no way that the slaves could have gotten in front of him without him noticing. He quickly came to the end of the trail, where a massive pile of bodies waited. As he approached, the ground rumbled, his only warning of what was to come. He leaped backwards, and a monster emerged from the ash beneath where he had been standing, almost catching him in its massive jaws. It looked like a lion, albeit one that was 3 times larger than its earthly counterpart. It had foot-long claws, and its mouth bristled with razor-sharp teeth. It roared at Jonathan, and charged. He dodged and analyzed the monster, finding that it was exactly what he had been looking for. Leonid Ash Reaver, Elite. Level 34. In fact, judging by its bulk, perhaps he had bitten off a little bit more than he could chew. It was the largest monster that he had directly fought, as the titanic reptilian beast did not count, and he had to admit that it was more than a little bit intimidating. Jonathan summoned his mana drills to his hands, the light of the skill faintly illuminating his arms. Jonathan snapped his hands forward, raking across the monster's side and back. He carved furrows into its fur, but the attack did not do much to the skin underneath, which felt as hard as stone. Jonathan condensed the balls even further and added as much power as he could, this time managing to cut into the flesh. The reaver roared, the noise deafening in such close proximity. Jonathan cringed, his ears bleeding, but he powered through the pain. By the time that the monster had finally passed him, its side was bleeding heavily. However, it seemed mostly uninjured, and it whirled around, activating some sort of ability. 2 jets of flame formed on its hind legs, and it leapt forward, moving faster than Jonathan could dodge. He bent forward, and felt the beast pass over him. Its claws raked across his scalp, drawing blood. He thrust his hand up, and sent a burst of condensed mana into the beast's soft underbelly, drawing blood. A moment later, his hand made contact with something soft and squishy, and he cringed. The beak yowled with a high-pitched cadence as the mana ball carved into its prized possessions. At least Jonathan knew that it was male now. He emerged from the other side, covered in blood, some of it his own, and some from the lion. He turned around, and saw that the beast was coming straight for him, utterly enraged. Its face was creased in rage, and it howled its displeasure, sending a cone of force towards Jonathan, ruffling his hair. He rolled to the side, but the monster slashed out with its forepaw, carving a line down his side. Jonathan screamed in agony, and continued his roll, pushing off the paw behind him. The fight had barely begun, and he was already seriously injured. Jonathan shook his head to clear the fog in it from his injuries. The pain was mostly manageable, seeing as he was far more resilient than any normal human being. That applied to his pain resistance as well. It would be pointless to have the durability of a piece of stone, but still feel every bump and scrape, even if it did not affect you. Instead, he was left with an all-too-welcome numbing of his senses while in battle. Otherwise some of the pain that he would have to deal with would be crippling. Jonathan summoned the mana back to his hands, and prepared to re-engage in battle. As the Leonid Reaver approached, it began to build up something in the back of its throat, something that was redolent of mana to Jonathan's senses. Now was as good a time as any to test his new epic rank skill. Sending a tendril of disruptive mana towards the growing skill, he tried to destabilize it. Jonathan sent as much of his mana as he could into the skill, empowering it beyond its limits. The tendril of mana became visible as he worked, and soon the Leonid noticed that something was wrong. Jonathan sensed the build-up of mana begin to decrease, but he would not let the monster get away with that. Instead, he pulsed his own mana along the length of the tendril, compressing it to increase its power. The expertise that he had gained with his mana drills came in handy here. With a hump, the skill exploded, scorching the inside of the monster's mouth. Because it had been successful in removing some of the mana, the backlash was not as intense, but it still was quite severe. The monster's tongue was scorched to a cinder, and it bellowed in pain, before setting its rage-filled eyes on Jonathan. It growled softly, and exploded into motion, red light burgeoning around its form. It was using some sort of skill that charged too quickly for Jonathan to disrupt. It was upon him in an instant, its claws ready to eviscerate him in the blink of an eye. He barely got his hands in front of himself in time, and the claws skittered against his gauntlets. His fingers broke at the contact, but he managed to prevent any further injury. The monster swiped again, and this time it moved slowly enough for Jonathan to duck under the blow. The punch landed like a low-yield bomb, blasting away flesh and bone around the impact site. Before the monster could recover, Jonathan thrust his other hand into the wound, and triggered his mana drill skill. Flesh and blood vanished before the hungry touch of the energy, and the monster let out a shriek of pure pain. Jonathan quickly withdrew his hand, and leaped backwards as the monster came crashing down, trying to crush him beneath its bulk. Bloody froth foamed at the edge of its mouth, and it seemed to be weakening. Still, Jonathan was in quite bad shape as well, and he didn't know how much longer he could fight for. Jonathan kept his feet however, and he was able to stand for long enough to get out of the way. He lacked the strength to get in and out from under its stomach for long enough to inflict more damage, and he instead settled for punching it into the side with a mana-imbued fist. The attack crashed in, but it was nowhere near as devastating as it had been before. The fight was slowly but surely turning into something that he would need his strongest skill to win. It was a desperate, last-ditch gambit as it would damage him beyond repair unless he was able to level up, but he was confident about being able to level up from this titan among monsters. As soon as this happened, Jonathan banished the skill, coughing up blood and chunks of flesh. Using the skill for so long had begun to liquefy his internal organs, and only the essence coursing into him from his kill could fix that. He tried to remain conscious, but he eventually succumbed to the pain and blood loss. A few hours, or perhaps an entire day, later, Jonathan woke up next to the corpse of the massive monster, and he gaped at his handiwork. The battle was like a haze in his mind, and all he remembered was being forced to bring out his ultimate skill to defend himself against the creature. However, as he looked upon the broken and battered corpse, he stood in awe of the power that he had briefly channeled. It had inflicted a terrible toll on his body, only mitigated by him leveling up, but the damage was still awe-inspiring. Giant craters were smashed into the monster's flesh, and its head was completely gone, turned into a pile of meat. Notifications waited for him, and he eagerly opened them. You have killed a Leonid Ash Reaver. You have leveled up. The battle had only given him one level, which was certainly cutting it a bit close. It seemed that something was adjusting the amount of essence that he got from monsters, perhaps to adjust for his tremendous strength. It made sense, after all it would take more energy to increase more stat points, but it still reeked of the games of the system. It was probably ecstatic about being able to limit his strength. After all, if he died, then he would never figure out the true secret of the runes. There was something else there too, a message that filled Jonathan with dread. You have reached the cusp of your resilience threshold. Until you invest a free point into it, it will not increase. At least it was not something that he had no choice in, and he decided to save it until later, when he was pending a breakthrough on all of his stats. At that point, he would have no choice but to break through. There was one final notification waiting for him, which was for his quest. However, all it said was that he had been rewarded with revenge, which was all well and good, but ultimately useless. Jonathan ignored the existential dread from that near miss, and instead made sure that every one of his belongings was present. Finding that they were, he gathered up everything around him, finding a few of his Leviathan marks scattered across the ash, and left the scene. His clothes were covered in blood, and his armor was nearly on its last legs, with massive tears in the leather. The only thing that wasn't damaged were his gauntlets, which were still just as durable as ever. He walked off into the ash, trying as hard as he could to ignore the sight of the pile of corpses far behind him, where the bodies of the freed slaves rotted on the ash. He had led to their death, no matter how indirectly, and it made him feel terrible about his decisions. Realistically, even if he had stayed with them, they would still have all died, as the monster had been too powerful for him to both fight and defend the slaves, but unfortunately, hindsight didn't care. Eventually, Jonathan forcibly shut his mind down, and kept his brain unfocused, simply using his breathing to count the steps. A few hours later, he emerged from his meditative state, finding a notification waiting for him. You have gained a new skill. Meditation, uncommon. You can tear your mind away from the horrors of the real world for a long stretch of time, allowing you to take a break from your inner angst. It can also be used for passing long stretches of time. Jonathan tidied away the notification, and thought about the skill and its uses. It was certainly valuable in this area, with its endless monotony, but did he really want to excise large portions of his life? His time would be better spent furthering his progress with his mana manipulation skill. As soon as he thought that, he got to work. Keeping his core in his mind's eye, Jonathan began to poke and prod at the glowing blue orb, creating tendrils of mana that he worked in and out of the orb. He worked on his compressing skills too, as using mana within one's body without actually expanding it did not cost anything in the way of mana. Still, he almost had 1,000 points in the resource, and he wasn't going to run out without some serious exertion, but he had no idea where his travails would lead him next, and it could very well be days until he found anything of note. Instead, he worked on his mana manipulation skills within his own body. It was incredibly slow going, but he kept at it, until he eventually ranked up the skill a few days later. By that point, he had caught sight of another city in the distance, and was heading towards it. His enhanced physicality had rendered it so he did not need as much food as before, and his pack was still filled with cans. What he wanted, however, was to be able to buy some sort of proper armor. He had picked the leather armor initially in an attempt to fit his fighting style, but he had come to realize that it was almost useless. His strength and dexterity were good enough anyway to use heavier types of armor, and he was aiming for a suit of chainmail armor, or half-plate. He had no illusions about the price of such a thing, and he knew that it would be expensive, but he would cross that bridge when he got to it. For now, he trekked across the ash, through the remains of the ruined civilizations of the past, and towards his future. None of the various monsters of the ash heaps dared to assault him, and he did not have time to go chasing after such tiny morsels of essence. For now, he was confident that his strength was enough to deal with most threats that he could find. Having heard about the power of Granath from Kyra, all those days ago, he had been afraid that the monsters would become too powerful for him to beat, but other than that mysterious titanic reptile that had come for his blood, prompted by the system's rune, he had yet to encounter anything beyond his capabilities to fight. That was another question to ask when he reached the city. He needed to find out more about the infinite hells, if he was to be able to create a proper plan going forwards. All that he knew about them so far was the name of this circle, the fact that there were others, and the names of two of the circle rulers, the first one, and the final one. Other than that, he was basically clueless. Sure, he could try to muddle his way through everything, living by virtue of his strength, but he knew that road would only lead to ruin, and to truly thrive, he would need to strategize a little bit. It had been only pure luck that had gotten him this far, and there were more times that should have spelled his end than Jonathan could count. Whether from the first fetid ooze, or the various monsters of the wastes, Jonathan had been towing the line a bit too closely for his taste. There was only one true path to victory, and that path was an exceedingly narrow one so narrow in fact that Jonathan had no idea whether he was on it or not. He spent the rest of his journey to the city occupying himself with training and progressively more fatalistic thoughts. He was slowly starting to succumb to the curse of melodrama, and within his head, his view of the world was gradually growing more and more stark. He was the sole source of goodness in this twisted hellscape, and everyone else was the demons. So far, he had been proven right on this account, and he found it hard to believe that there was a single good soul in this world. Even Kyra, who had rescued him from his predicament, had been looking for money off him, rather than having done the deed out of the goodness of her heart. It was a depressing viewpoint, but one that was all too accurate. Lost in his haze, Jonathan only realized that the city was coming into view when it was literally in front of him. It had been a day since his rank up of his mana manipulation abilities, but he had been so engrossed in his own tortured mind that the time had slipped through his hands like water. This city was about the same size as Tehran, and it was made out of the same material too. However, it was a lot more imposing than that city, and there was a whole platoon of guards waiting outside of the gates. These ones did not look bored either, instead standing at attention. He knew that he could not brute force his way past these ones. More importantly, the walls were almost double the heights of those in Tehran, and he could see defenders waiting on the battlements, manning siege engines and bows. Jonathan paused, and deliberated on what to do next. Remembering his experiences in Tehran, he realized that there wouldn't be any impediment to his entry, seeing as he had money to bring. Last time, he had been denied entry because he had been a pauper, but now that he had actual Leviathan marks to spend, he was sure to be allowed entry. In addition, he didn't look like a vagrant anymore. No, he simply looked like an adventurer who had fallen on hard times, which was hardly better. Still, one of those people could actually enact change in the world, and Jonathan knew which one he was. He began walking towards the gates, keeping his motions slow and steady so as to not attract untoward attention from the defenders. He was just one man, and he doubted that they would see him as any sort of threat, but it was better to be safe. The guards perked up upon seeing him, and one of them drew their blade, but put it away after seeing how bad of a shape Jonathan was in. The defenders on the walls did not even glance in his direction, instead eyeing the distance, most likely watching out for monsters or marauders. Jonathan reached the gates a few minutes later, and stopped in front of the guards. They regarded him in stony silence for a few moments, and then one of them spoke. He had a dark plume on his helmet, and his armor seemed more ornate than that of the other guards. In addition, there was a faint aura of power that wafted off him, one that Jonathan was wary of. "Are you a marauder, or have you come here for trade? I have to say, your appearance does not exactly make me hopeful about your potential worth to this town." His tone was conversational enough, but there was an edge of hard steel to it that Jonathan took note of. "I ran afoul of some monsters a few days that way," he replied, pointing in the direction that he had come from. "I come here seeking refuge." It was close enough to the truth, and Jonathan hoped that would be enough. "Are you here to beg from our city? For if that is your purpose, you had better leave now, before I slit your throat and let you bleed out on the ash," the man replied, further reinforcing Jonathan's opinions of him. "I have money to spend, and I wish to spend it here." Jonathan withdrew a clinking handful of Leviathan marks from his pocket, showing them off the guards. To their credit, none of them seemed inclined to steal any from him. "Very well. The entry toll is 1 mark. Pay it now, or you will be refused entry," the guard captain said, holding out his hand. Jonathan sighed, and dropped a single coin into the man's hand. At least he had been honest about his desire for Jonathan's hard-earned money. The man whistled at the people manning the walls, and the gates behind the guards opened slowly, without a single creak. They were obviously in a state of constant use, and Jonathan wondered why this city was so focused on defense. The ranks of the guards parted before him, and Jonathan entered the city. The buildings were a step up from the ones in Tehran, with most of them reaching 2 stories in height. In addition, the people were not as disconsolate as the citizens of that town had been, although that could have been because they all looked like hard-bitten warriors. Even the children ran around carrying wicked-looking serrated knives in their belts. Guards patrolled the streets, and each of them was over level 15. This was certainly the right place for Jonathan to have come in search of armaments. He wandered the streets for a half hour, trying to find his bearings. Most of the buildings were residential apartments, with multiple families sharing a single floor, but there were a few inns and taverns around the city, and a disproportionately large number of smithies. It was into one of these smithies that Jonathan walked some time later, having seen a variety of fine wares lying around in the window. It had been advertised as the finest smithy in the town, and while Jonathan doubted that, it at least did not have a long line outside the front. He was not looking for the best quality of armor that he could find, as that would have been far beyond his means. Something lower tier, but affordable, would be perfect. A swarthy female dwarf sat behind the counter, and she seemed to be engaged in some sort of game where she tossed pieces of scrap metal into a receptacle on the far end of the room. Jonathan cleared his throat, and the woman looked up, unabashed. "Well? What can I do for you?" she replied, with a thick accent. "Are you here to buy, sell, or commission?" "Buy. I want to purchase a suit of chainmail, ideally enchanted. I am relatively new to the Hells, and I do not know what the currency is worth," Jonathan replied truthfully. That might have been a mistake, but the woman looked honest enough. "Well, 10 marks can get you a decent enough sword, and 50 will get you an enchanted one. For what you're looking for, I would say you would have to pay about 75 marks. Armor isn't in as high demand as weapons, but it is more expensive to manufacture." "Are you the smith here?" Jonathan asked, wondering why there was no visible forge in the vicinity. "Nah. That would be my father. That great lunk is in the back, hammering away at something." The woman looked backwards and then yelled at the top of her voice. "Pa! Come in here, we have a customer." Someone grumbled in the back of the smithy, and a heavily scarred dwarf lumbered out of the back room. He was an imposing specimen, almost as wide as he was tall. His tattered apron revealed arm muscles the size of Jonathan's head, and he seemed like he could wrestle and bear, and win. "Scrawny little bugger, aren't you?" the man said without any sort of preamble. "You gotta get some more meat on those bones, you hear?" For the first time in his trip to the Hells, Jonathan was convinced that he was standing before two honest individuals. The dwarves seemed friendly, and the fact that the male one had been in a relationship long enough to have a child spoke volumes about his character. The fact that he had taken care of the girl even more so. "Perhaps," Jonathan said, chuckling. "I am here to purchase some armor, and then be on my way." "Armor, you say? Beatrice, did you tell the man what our prices are?" "Yeah. He was looking for an enchanted set of chainmail, and I told him that it would set him back about 75 marks, she replied. "Good girl. Like I've said many times before, we may be in the Hells, but honesty still applies." Turning to Jonathan, the man continued speaking. "You'll have to wait a few hours for me to finish your commission. It won't take me long to make the armor, given my level, but the enchanting takes some time. Why don't you explore the town while you're waiting? Don't let the air dissuade you from walking around a bit. The people may be a bit paranoid, but they're fine enough folk. I noticed that everyone is armed to the teeth out there. Why is that? This town is on the path of the many ash storms that come rolling through here every few weeks. Every time that accursed worm, Granath, sets out to create more monsters, he stirs up all the existing ones nearby, and they charge across the land in search of prey. After a few days, the horde's momentum peters out, and they spread out, but for a few days, they tear through anything that comes in their path. For some reason, they all go in the same direction, which happens to pass through here." The man then frowned at Jonathan. "You're a freshly damned, aren't you? You sound like you're new to the Hells." "That I am. Actually, I was looking for some sort of information source on this world. Is there anywhere I can find one? You can check out the city archive. Old Janessa keeps a tight watch on her books, but she has a soft spot for those who are in search of knowledge. It's next to the Flayed Arm Tavern. You can't miss it. Now, I have some work to get to." Jonathan thanked the man, and walked out the door, wondering what sort of fatalistic attitude would lead one to name a tavern such a gruesome name. As he passed by other taverns, he saw that such names were universal, although his favorite was a dingy-looking establishment called the Bloody Stool. Despite the off-putting name, there seemed to be many patrons there, enjoying its wares. Jonathan personally would have been hard-pressed to partake of anything from that establishment without being reminded of its name, but it seemed that the folk here were used to it. A few minutes later, he had found the Flayed Arm, a large tavern near the center of the city. Next to it was a dome-shaped building, with a large sign at the top. The sign marked it as the City Archives. There was nobody near the place, with most of them being in the nearby tavern, and Jonathan quickly walked inside. He was instantly transported to another world, one of silence and parchment, with the dim lighting of lanterns suffusing all. There was only one other soul in the entire place, a woman sitting behind a desk made out of gnarled wood at the center of the room. Her skin was red, and she had two curving horns poking out of her forehead. Despite what the smith had said about her, the woman seemed in the prime of youth. Jonathan quickly walked over to the woman, who did not bother to look up. He waited for a moment, and then coughed lightly. "Don't cough at me, young man," the woman said, her voice raspy. "I'm doing something important." "Sorry," Jonathan said, mollified. "The smith told me that you might have information on the infinite hells." "Which smith?" "That dwarven lunk, Petrag. You can tell him to stop bandying my name around to any vagabond who comes calling." Despite the woman's sharp tone, she seemed quite fond of the man, as her voice softened upon saying his name. "I don't know about the smiths in this town, but he was a dwarf." "Do you happen to have any information though?" Jonathan asked. "Yes. There's a whole section over there next to the romantic fiction area. Don't ask me why we have that trash here, but the townspeople love it. They use it as some sort of escape from the real world." The woman resumed her work after the critical remark, and Jonathan left her, walking in the direction that she had pointed. He found himself standing in front of a dusty shelf that was sparsely populated, with only about a dozen books on the entire thing. Half of them were worthless, with only speculative entries about what lay further down in the hells, but one of them seemed promising to Jonathan, and he picked it up. The Path of the Hellbreaker, a Story of Divine Might. Jonathan quickly gathered that book under his arm, and tried to find some sort of reference book. He quickly found a book that professed to be a repository for information about the ash heaps, but there was nothing about the rest of the infinite hells. He took the two books to a nearby table, and got to work reading. Starting with the reference book, he got to work. The ash heaps, also known as the wastes of desolation, is the first circle of the infinite hells. It is the weakest, but the one with the most inhabitants, seeing as most lack the strength to merit punishment in the lower hells. Ruled by Granath the Despoiler, it is a land of endless ruins and ash punctuated by the occasional city, populated by the souls of the damned. Those who succumb to the horrors of the descent are consumed body and soul by Granath, and repurposed as the various horrors that walk the ash. The book was written in a strange way, one that seemed purpose-built for those with high intelligence. Somehow, it had been enchanted to convey a wealth of information through a smaller amount of text than Jonathan would have expected. For example, just from reading that one passage, a detailed image of the ash heaps had somehow formed in his mind, accentuating the words on the page. It was a strange sort of magic, but one that he found quite useful. With that in mind, he flipped through the book, looking for relevant sections. The first such section that he saw was about the various monsters of the region. Within the ash heaps, strength is stratified by proximity, or extremity, to the center of the circle. The actual region itself extends out past where anyone has dared to venture, but there is a strip of land, about 10,000 miles across, where the monsters are comparatively weak. As one grows closer to the center or the far reaches of the land, however, the monsters begin to become more powerful. The strongest being in the world is Granath, the ruler of this circle of the infinite hells. However, creatures lurk in the far reaches of the world that are almost at his level of strength. The sleeping titans, a range of living mountains, are one of the first things that one sees upon entering the ash heaps. This is believed to be for the purpose of instilling fear and hopelessness in new arrivals, as the actual monsters in question are so far beyond the edges of the habitable zone that they are nearly unreachable. The monsters may be an imposing sight, but they are rumored to be almost harmless, seeing as they are unable to move. However, there is a possibility that this is just a rumor. Caution is advised to anyone seeking them out. On the lower levels of the monster population, there are creatures such as ash prowlers and fetid oozes, which prey on the weak. Now that Jonathan had read the passage, an image of the mountain range that he had seen upon arrival was burned into his mind. The image was at a far closer range that his own sight had been able to discern, and he was able to see that the mountains were actually curled-up humanoids, covered in rocky flesh. Their heads ended in saw-like protuberances, each of which was hundreds of feet in length. Jonathan shook his head, banishing the image, and continued reading. As one grows in power, they will quickly find that to progress, they will have to make their way towards more dangerous sections of the world. This serves Granath well, as it inevitably sends them off into the far reaches, where they will quickly die, or towards him, where he can twist them to his dark desires. Jonathan had been suffering from the essence drought that was the lower-leveled monsters, and he knew exactly what this passage was talking about. He would have to make a decision soon, whether to head for the interior, or towards the perimeter of the ash heaps. Both were fraught with danger, but he was slightly more inclined towards the perimeter of the world, seeing as it was his only shot at reaching the necessary level of power to defeat Granath. He was sure that there were no creatures approaching the demon's strength anywhere within the interior. He would have to find them somewhere else. As it happened, the next section of the book was about Granath himself, and Jonathan quickly flipped the yellowed pages towards a section about his history. Like the other circle rulers, Granath was created eons ago by the Dark Lord of Hell, Angranor, and has been in a constant struggle against his brethren for dominance. In a complicated game called the Infernal Court, circle rulers vie for power against one another, seeking to defeat their neighbors, and progress further down the circles, toward their master. Granath has been the weakest of their number from the very start, but he is still monstrously strong. No force within the ash heaps can hope to defeat him. His form is that of a gargantuan worm, with a vaguely humanoid head. His body is truly immense, reaching hundreds of feet in length. He also possesses strong magical abilities, not least of which is his ability to devour the souls of the damned. Jonathan was about to turn the page, but he heard a faint rustling from behind him, and he spun around to see Janessa hovering over him. "Are you finally realizing that your quest is hopeless?" the woman asked, her raspy voice cutting through the silence. "Huh? What quest?" Jonathan asked, feigning ignorance. "Don't play dumb with me. You are following the path of the Hellbreaker, are you not? It was written all over your auric signature. I don't know why someone of your meager level is chasing that myth, but I implore you to stop. You will die, just like the rest of them." A tear glistened in the woman's yellow eye, and she blinked it away. "Never mind that. Durvan wouldn't want me moping over him anyway." "How did you know all that?" Jonathan asked, shocked. "Like I said, your aura is like an open book. You have impressive power for one so recently sent to the hells. Here, analyze me, why don't you?" the woman replied. Jonathan obliged, and was struck dumb by what he found. Janessa. Demonic hybrid. Level 77. He sputtered wordlessly at what he saw written before him. A high level, is it not? My partner and I were following that path many decades ago, but when we reached the Ashen Citadel, we found ourselves woefully unprepared for the power of its defenders. I could have eviscerated you before you even realized I had moved, but Granath is far beyond even that. My husband was killed by one of his lowliest guards, and I barely escaped with my life, and with the majority of my power gone. All that is left of me is the meaningless number on my stat sheet. In reality I am weaker than a babe. That is why I implore you not to throw away your life on this meaningless quest. Progress, of course, but do not reach for things beyond your station. Now the dome began to rumble, and books fell off their shelves, clattering to the floor. Jonathan stood, alarmed. Janessa bit her lip, and sighed. You came at the most inopportune time. The monster horde is coming. You will have to help defend the city. What about you? Will you be all right? Jonathan asked. Don't worry about me. I'll be safe here. Besides, I still have some of my old tricks left. Now go. The woman shouted at him. A strange force seized him and propelled him towards the doors, sending him sprawling out onto the street. People milled about, with their weapons drawn, organizing themselves into small units. On the walls, defenders scrambled to load the ballistas and catapults mounted there, and archers began to knock arrows to their bows. The gates opened, and the guards rushed back inside, as fast as their legs could carry them. A trio of burly orcs came running down the main street, bearing a large slab of metal between them. With a grunt, they heaved it into place behind the gate, sealing it tightly. Jonathan noticed Petrag and his daughter running down the street, both of them dressed in armor. He waved at the pair, who paused in front of him. You really are an unlucky one, aren't you? Petrag exclaimed, some of his accent gone. I was almost finished with your armor too. I have a quota to fill on the walls though. Hold on, almost finished. How much more time do you need? Jonathan asked. About a quarter of an hour. Why? I can hold your place on the wall, Jonathan said. What do I need to do? The dwarf laughed at this, and pointed at the massive crossbow on his back. He quickly sighted along its length and effortlessly drew the string back, knocking it on the small hook at the end of the crossbow. Raising one eyebrow at the dwarf, who looked shocked, Jonathan released the string, able to hold the tension within his hands without letting it snap back. Do I meet your standards? How never mind that. Beatrice, go with him and hand him arrows. You know what to do. The man turned around and ran back towards the smithy, and Beatrice flashed Jonathan a smile. He gave her one in return, and followed the wash of people down the street towards the walls. Following the vague directions being hollered by the guards, he ran up the stairs, with Beatrice following. The walls were packed with people, but Jonathan ignored all of that in favor of what was beyond the walls. What looked at a distance like a living tide of ash was hurtling across the land, and when he focused in on the front of the wave, he was able to make out monsters milling around in the midst of it. Beatrice handed him a thick crossbow bolt, and he began to knock it, still looking at the sight in front of him. The rest of the defenders began to load their weapons as well, and a few moments later, a man came running along the battlements, touching his glowing hands to the weapons. He passed by Jonathan a moment later, and a white glow spread across the crossbow, before concentrating into the tip of the bolt. Jonathan was able to sense the work of another mage, and he tried to find out what exactly the man had done to the bolt. Before he could do so, however, the monsters came into range. Fire! Someone bellowed from the far end of the wall, unleashing a wave of projectiles. Jonathan propped the crossbow up against his shoulder, and fired, the glowing projectile hurtling toward the monsters. It landed a moment later, and exploded, blowing apart a dozen monsters in a single blast. However, that barely made a dent in the horde. Other explosions rocked the horde, some smaller and some larger, working away at the front lines. Still, it was barely a drop in an ocean, and soon the monsters crashed against the walls, shaking them to their foundations. They rushed past them in an unceasing torrent, and soon bits of masonry began to fall. Although each monster was individually too weak to do anything to the walls, the force from all of them at once was more than sufficient. As the defenders desperately loosed arrows into the fray, the tide began to slow and soon the forms of the monsters were few and far between. The defenders around Jonathan sighed in relief, but none of them returned. Turning to Beatrice, he was met with a shake of the head. That was only the beginning. In between each wave, a few elites come, and those can only be taken out in melee combat. As she spoke, Jonathan spotted a few shadowy shapes in the distance, which quickly turned into over 20. Half of them were alpha ash prowlers, but he spotted a few massive fetid oozes, and even another one of the ash reavers. A few monsters that he knew nothing about walked among the elites too. Someone came running up the stairs, and Jonathan turned to see. It was Petrag, and the man bore a set of sparkling chain armor over his right shoulder. Panting heavily, he handed it off to Jonathan, snatching his crossbow back. With the strength that you showed earlier, your place is out there, facing the elites. I'll give you this armor, free of charge, if you do that. Jonathan had already been planning to do this, and he nodded wordlessly, beginning to put on the armor. It was time to get some more levels. He quickly donned the armor, not bothering to remove his tattered leather set, and found that it was far more comfortable than he had expected. He felt power surging through his body from the armor, but did not have time to analyze it. Instead, he ran over to the wall and vaulted over it, drawing shouts of amazement from everyone else there. He landed on the ash outside of the city, and waited there for his support. There were supposed to be others coming, and while he could have charged the monsters on his own, he did not fancy his chances against the wall of elites. A few moments later, 5 others landed on the ash at varying distances from Jonathan. There were 2 melee fighters, with a sword and an axe respectively, 2 mages, who had orbs of condensed mana hovering around their hands, and finally, the man who had performed the spell on the weapons earlier. They all stared at Jonathan, who they had not been expecting. Before any one of them could call him out, however, the monsters charged, the ground shaking. Shots began to rain down from the battlements above, and Jonathan sped forward, his feet sending up drifts of ash. To everyone's shock, he outpaced both of the melee fighters, who were running at high speeds themselves. Without pausing, Jonathan leapt forwards at the nearest elite, one of the ash prowler alphas, and brought his fist down on its head with a surge of power. Mana crackled around his gauntlet, and monster blood splattered the ground around him as his fist slammed straight into flesh. A great crater was blasted out of the monster in question and it yowled in pain. Fire began to build up in its throat, but Jonathan sent his right fist in a devastating right hook towards the monster's jaws. Metal met flesh and metal won, tearing the bottom jaw of the monster clean off. Its fire sputtered out, and Jonathan thrust his hand into the creature's head, boiling its brain with his mana. Sliding the corpse off his hand, he raced towards the next monster. All around him, arrows and ballista bolts rained down, interspersed with a few spells. None of them came anywhere near Jonathan, a testament to the skill of the archers at the top of the battlements. The other fighters were all in the process of fighting too, although none of them had been able to kill a monster yet. Both of the melee fighters seemed to be pure warriors, without any magical ability between them. Likewise, the 2 mages were entirely focused on magic, moving barely faster than a normal human. Nobody else had the same stat bonuses that Jonathan had, nobody normal at any rate, and as a result most people specialized heavily. The other fighter, the man who had empowered the projectiles earlier, had an entirely unique style of fighting that he picked out rocks from his pocket, and imbued them with white light before lobbing them at the monsters. Although the rocks were barely visible, they landed with the force of grenades, blasting chunks out of their targets. Jonathan took this all in as he quickly dismantled the next ash prowler, his fists moving so fast that all anybody on the wall saw was a blur. Mana hissed and popped through raw flesh as he fought, leaving yet another charred corpse in his wake. He was rapidly outgrowing the basic monsters in this area, and as he moved on to one of the fetid oozes, he hoped that he could find a challenge in this one. This particular fetid ooze, as an elite, was twice the size of the one he had fought before and had 2 arms rather than 1. Other than that, it was basically the same creature, covered in grotesque boils and with a misshapen body. Its massive maw yawned hungrily open as Jonathan approached, and its twin fists shot out like lightning a moment later. Even with all of his speed, Jonathan was barely able to dodge the attack, and one of the arms grazed the top of his head. Wet blood ran down the sides of his scalp, and he found that a large chunk of skin was missing. Just the slightest edge of the monster's punch had utterly devastated the top of his head, and Jonathan knew that this was not an opponent to take lightly. He ducked under a return strike, and grabbed at the arm above him, forcing mana through his fists and into his hands. The creature burned as the mana struck it, but the rate at which skin melted away was far slower than with the other monsters. The creature chortled wetly and yanked its arm free, before backhanding Jonathan with its other arm as he unbalanced. He went skipping 20 feet across the ground, and only came to a stop after he thrust his hands deep into the ash. His entire body felt like a slab of tenderized meat, but luckily there was nothing broken. The monster had not been able to build up enough speed to seriously injure him. Jonathan got to his feet, spotting one of the ash prowlers coming straight for him, taking note of his relative weakness. With a snarl, he slammed the mana out of his core and into the world, imbuing his gauntlets with power. The monster built up fire in its throat, and Jonathan tried to tug at it with his unravel skill. However, nothing happened. It seemed that the fiery breath was a natural ability of the monster, and had nothing at all to do with mana manipulation. Jonathan sighed, but was undeterred. He could kill the thing with his bare hands if need came to it. The Fetidus elite was trundling across the ash in the background, but there was enough time before the slow monster came near him to kill the ash prowler. Jonathan widened his stance and held his hands out in front of himself, getting ready to fight. The nearer of the two monsters came howling towards his neck, trying to set off its fire ability as close as it could to his face. Jonathan ducked underneath the creature and punched it into the underbelly, sending it off course. The ball of fire went soaring through the air, landing on one of the unidentified elites. The creature looked like some sort of giant bird, and it hissed as the fire landed on its back. The scariest thing was that the orb of glowing energy barely burnt the thing. It turned around from its current position, which was facing off against the two melee fighters, and opened its beak wide. It flapped its wings once and then charged across the ash, using its wings to propel itself at high speeds. Jonathan grabbed the ash prowler and swung it into the path of the bird. It seemed that the fireball had been enough to dispel the uneasy peace between the monsters, and the bird skewered it on its razor-sharp beak, before opening its jaws, tearing the monster in half. Unfortunately, it now had its eyes locked on Jonathan. The Fetidus began to turn around, knowing when it was beaten, instead heading towards the man empowering the rocks in the background. The bird lashed out at Jonathan with its beak, spearing into the center of his chest. He knocked the beak aside at the last minute, but it still impacted his chest, knocking him back a step. There was a small dent in one of the chain links, but nothing major. The armor certainly was worth more money than the smith had asked for. Still, it felt like he had been hit by a carriage, and his chest ached from the blow. One of his ribs had splintered from the force, and he knew that it was time for him to get serious. He sent 200 points of mana out of his core and into his hands, condensing the resulting flares of blue energy down the smallest size that he could create. 2 golf ball-sized orbs of scintillating light hovered on the ends of his fists, and as the bird attacked again, he punched. Fist met beak, and the mana ate through the hard surface of the creature's natural weapon, causing it to withdraw hastily. Jonathan nailed it in the neck with a blow from his left hand, and the monster wheezed as he sent caustic mana into its windpipe. It recovered quickly however, and swiped to the side with its now shortened beak, knocking Jonathan head over heels in the direction of the walls. He rolled as he fell, getting back to his feet just in time to block another strike from the bird monster. It was both incredibly fast and incredibly dangerous, packing a serious punch. He grabbed its beak in both hands and twisted, causing the monster to let out a muffled screech of pain. The thing kicked out with one of its legs, lifting Jonathan off the ground and knocking the wind out of his lungs. Some of the food he had eaten recently threatened to come back up, but he kept it down with a force of will, and held on. As he flew up and over the monster's head, he yanked with all of his might, sending the bird skidding forward as he pulled at its beak and neck. It tried to pull him back towards the front of its body, but he was too strong for it, and instead he tore its legs out from under it, landing with the monster's beak in his hand. With a titanic jerk of his arms, he tore the beak right off the monster in a welter of yellowish blood. The bird wriggled free of his grasp, but with its biggest weapon gone, it was now trivial to deal with. As it came charging towards him, preparing to kick, he brought his right hand streaking towards the air and into the side of the monster's head. There was an explosion of blue light, and the thing's small head exploded, sending gore flying everywhere. The monster collapsed backwards, and lived no more. By this point, more than half of the monsters were dead, but one of the warriors, the one with the axe, was on his last legs, bleeding out on the ash. His partner was fighting desperately to head off a trio of ash prowlers, but the wolf-like beasts were slowly overwhelming him, and forcing the man backwards so that they could get at the weakened warrior he was protecting. The two mages were too busy fending off the other monsters with bolts of blue light, and the mage with the empowerment abilities was facing off against the fetid oozes, tossing rocks into their gaping maws. One of the downsides of the monster's massive jaws was that it was unable to close them fully, leaving a weak spot. When the explosive rocks were tossed into the monster's mouth, they did considerable damage. Jonathan saw that his aid was needed most with the two warriors, and he pushed off the ground, running as quickly as he could towards his beleaguered allies. He reached the duo within seconds, and his fist took a monster out of the fight, sending the ash prowler skidding across the ground, a bloody wound gaping open on its side. Jonathan followed the monster, and pummeled it into the ground with his spiked gauntlets, brutally killing the creature. Turning around, he saw that his efforts had allowed the warriors to fend off the last two creatures, with the dying one getting the odd strike off. Jonathan admired the man's tenacity, and he quickly made his way back towards him, trying to get there in time to kill another one of the prowlers. His mana-imbued fist came in like a blue-streaked meteor, sending blood and bone flying as it slammed into the nearest one of the monsters. It howled in pain, and he flipped over its back, grabbing it by the scruff of the neck. He brought it flying over his head, and slammed it into the other ash prowler, breaking bones. The first one expired, its body unable to take the stress anymore, and the second one was heavily injured. Jonathan withdrew, allowing the warrior with the sword to kill the remaining ash prowler. The man nodded in thanks, and attended to his wounded companion. Jonathan quickly ran off in search of another monster. The nearest one, a strange hybrid of a monkey and a slug, oozed across the ash towards him, its slime leaving a trail of caustic acid behind. It was incredibly slow, at least compared to him, but it was heavily armored, with plates of rocky bone covering the majority of its upper body. The only thing left unexposed was the underside of its body, where it slid across the ground. The top half of its body was dominated by two muscular arms and a huge torso, which ended in a grotesquely elongated monkey's head. Jonathan narrowed his eyes and renewed the mana on his fists, getting ready to eliminate the creature. The thing swung its right arm towards him as he approached, trying to catch him off guard. He dashed past its ponderous strike, and drove his fist into its side. Rather than breaking through the armor, however, one of his knuckles cracked. The mana dissipated across the surface, sinking into the armor. Jonathan quickly withdrew and scanned the monster. Simian Mana Leech, Elite. Level 34. The name told him everything he needed to know about why his attack had been ineffective. Using his mana had actually weakened the effect of his punch, giving power to the monster rather than damaging it. He quickly banished the mana, and punched again, this time managing to crack the armor. The creature let out a low grunt, and swung its fist towards him, trying to trap him between its arm and its body. Jonathan ducked down, and came surging upwards when the arm passed above him, cracking his gauntlet into the monster's chin. The creature grunted, and was driven up and off its slug-like lower half, almost falling backwards. Jonathan pressed the advantage, but as he punched again, the monster began to exude a torrent of sticky and acidic slime, covering most of its body with the stuff. Jonathan quickly aborted his strike, not wanting to have his flesh melt off his bones. There was a place where there was no slime, however, which was on the monster's face, where there was no rocky coating. That would be the only place that he could effectively strike. With a shout, he leaped off the ground, and punched forwards with all of His might, aiming his fist, summoned with a large ball of mana, towards the monster's face. It grinned at him wickedly and lifted up its slime-covered arm, placing it in the way of his strike. However, the mana had not been for the monster, rather there to burn away the slime. The liquid crackled and burned away as the mana crashed into it, and as soon as the slime was gone in that area, Jonathan banished the skill and used the raw power of his fist, imbued with his strength score of over 100 points. The monster's arm bent backwards with the force of the blow, and Jonathan drove his fist through the rocky covering and into the bone beneath. The coating on its arms was thinner than on the rest of its body, meaning that the attack did not do too much damage to the rest of the creature, but it was still rocked backwards by the strike. Jonathan quickly followed up with a barrage of such strikes, tearing into the creature's body. Normally this thing would have been the bane of adventurers, with its resistance to mana and its high defense, but he was strong and fast enough to cancel out both advantages, relying solely on his own body. Soon the monster was covered in cracks, with a few gaping holes from where Jonathan had landed more than one strike in the same spot. He grinned at the monster, before thrusting his gauntlet into one such hole, on the monster's arm, and grabbing its bone. The creature bucked, trying to get him off, but he held firm, and with a disgusting tearing noise, he ripped the creature's arm apart at the elbow. It keened in agony, and brought its other fist streaking towards Jonathan. He redirected the attack with a clever use of his skill, sending the strike up and over his head, before swinging around and tossing the monster. It was too heavy for him to toss over his shoulder, but what happened was arguably better. The monster's arm broke off at the shoulder, and he was left holding it like a club. To add insult to injury, he whirled around, and smashed the rocky appendage into the mana leech's face. The monster howled from the pain of all its injuries, and Jonathan ran forwards, intending to finish the fight quickly. However, the monster had other plans. There was a brief flash of blinding blue light, and an orb of power blossomed in front of the creature. Tendrils ran from the orb and into the monster's body, and as the orb grew bigger, the creature shrunk and deflated, as if its life force was being drained. Jonathan backed away, and when the ball grew to its full size, it detonated, blasting him away. The blast radius was far more than he had expected, and his arms almost broke from the power contained within that strike. He came to a sudden halt, slamming into the city walls. More bones broke, but he was able to push past the pain, noting that none of them were anything especially vital to his fighting prowess. Jonathan extricated himself from the wall, having sunk into the stone by a small amount, and found himself back on his feet in no time. The man looked in the direction of the mana leech, only seeing a splatter of blood and slime across a good portion of the ash. It had killed itself with its final strike, and Jonathan felt its essence enter him. However, it was significantly less than he had expected, meaning that the monster had been credited with its own death for some absurd reason. He surveyed the rest of the battlefield, seeing that the fight was almost over. The beleaguered pair of fighters were heading towards the city gates, with the wounded one seemingly on the brink of death. They were both still alive however, which was good. Meanwhile, the three mages were in a complicated dance with the Ash Reaver, trying to keep it at bay with kinetic strikes. The monster roared in rage as it was forced away from their position over and over, its body slowly but surely breaking apart before the blows. The two conventional mages were clearly focused on quantity over quality, and they spat out a veritable storm of mana attacks, none of which was particularly damaging on their own. In a barrage numbering in the dozens however, they were devastating. Meanwhile, the enhancer threw his imbued rocks every few seconds or so, breaking into the rhythm of the other mages. When his attacks landed, noticeably large chunks of flesh and bone were blasted apart, and the Reaver stumbled. However, the trio were rapidly running out of mana, evidenced by the harangued looks on their faces, and the slowly diminishing rate of fire. Without a second's hesitation, Jonathan charged for the mages, his broken bones rattling within himself painfully. He pushed past the sharp pain, focusing on the battle ahead. When he reached the mages, they briefly paused their barrage, distracting the Reaver for long enough for Jonathan to land a clean strike on its back leg. Already weakened from the barrage, the creature stumbled backwards, its leg bent at an odd angle. It opened its mouth to roar in displeasure, but a stone arced through the air on a perfect trajectory, landing straight in the creature's mouth. There was a pause, and then the creature's head exploded, showing the mages with blood and gore. Jonathan gave the three fighters a friendly nod and headed off towards the last surviving knot of elites, which were one of the fetid oozes, and three of the ash prowlers. The other fighters and him had killed off all the other monsters by this point, which was quite impressive. The monster howled and leapt at him, trying to get to him before he could strike. His fist met its jaw, and its head was blasted straight off its shoulder, the mana cutting through its neck like it wasn't even there. Jonathan grabbed the corpse out of the air, and threw it towards the fetid ooze, distracting it for long enough to move on to the next of the ash prowlers. The two remaining ones pounced at the same time, but they were struck out of the air by a well-timed imbued rock from the mage in the background, and Jonathan was upon them, punishing them for their mistake. Each fist broke bones and tore flesh, and he quickly had the beasts on the ropes. The fetid ooze had begun to move towards him, uninterested in the corpse that he had thrown, but he had enough time to kill off these monsters. The creature bit down on his chainmail armor, unable to get past its immaculate defense. Jonathan tensed his muscles and then roared in exertion, swinging the monsters together. The two creatures splattered against one another in a hideous shower of blood, and he brought them crashing together once more, finally killing the things. Leaving them aside, Jonathan raced towards the fetid ooze, which was sliding across the ash towards him, a look of hunger distending its enlarged jaw even more than it was normally. He swung at the last moment, and met its fist in midair, both fighters struggling to maintain their equilibrium. The monster was incredibly strong, with its grotesquely enlarged muscles, but Jonathan was slightly stronger, especially with his new armor. With a roar, he pushed the arm backwards, and closed the gap, pummeling the monster's flabby exterior with his gauntlets. It chortled at him as he did so, and as bloody wounds began to mount on its body, it suddenly opened its mouth, seeking to envelop his hands in it. Seeing the razor-sharp teeth that lined its maw, Jonathan quickly snatched his hands back, before punching again after it snapped down, splintering its decaying teeth. The monster let out a wet gurgling sound, and opened its mouth wide. Yet another of the well-timed imbued stones came whistling through the air, and popped into the creature's mouth. It shuddered as an explosion ripped through its insides. Unlike the ash reaver, however, it was built for durability, and it did not fall. Jonathan's fist crashed into the top of its head a moment later, and it rocked backwards, unbalanced by the strike. He quickly followed up with a quick volley of punches, rocking it further and further off balance. After about 10 of these, he swung for the fences, driving his fist into the rubbery flesh of the monster with everything he had. The creature was lifted off its slug-like body, and fell backwards. It struggled to right itself, but it was too late. Jonathan leapt into the air, and tilted his body towards the monster. Condensing a ball of mana in his hands, Jonathan came crashing down, driving the energy into the monster's head. It splattered beneath him, and the monster let out one last gurgle before dying. With that, the battle was over. Notifications spiraled into his vision, but he cleared them all away except for the one telling him of the levels that he had gained. As his flesh and bones knitted back together, he stared at it in disbelief. "You have leveled up, X2. Jonathan gaped at the low number in astonishment, that quickly turned to rage. He had personally defeated almost half of those monsters, and he had only gained enough essence to gain 2 levels. What the hell? He exclaimed, as he looked at the notification, hoping to have misread it. If he had been a little less assiduous with finishing off the monsters, he might well have walked out of that without any sort of levels at all, leaving him at the mercy of his injuries. He closed the notification with a grunt and headed back towards the city, where the mages were walking. As he walked through the open gates, he was greeted with a storm of cheering from the townspeople. They were lined up on either side of the street in front of him, and he could see Petrag and Beatrice there, clapping with the others. Jonathan waved at the townspeople, wondering what exactly had attracted all the attention. As he entered the town, and the gates swung shut behind him. An elderly man walked up to him, with a smile on his face. "You are a marvel, my boy," the man said, his voice genuinely happy. "You did more work out there than our finest warriors. How can we ever repay you?" "Well, I was given this armor for fighting, so I suppose that is payment enough for me," Jonathan answered. "Ah yes. Petrag's fine work. I would recognize it from anywhere." "Well, if you are content with that, then who am I to push more on you?" The man paused, as if remembering something. "Right. How rude of me. I never introduced myself. I am Grainel Evanson, mayor of this town. You never met me because my talents are not exactly suited to fighting." The man gave the gathered crowds a glance, and then looked over at Jonathan. "Would you mind if we conversed privately? I have some propositions for you." "That would be fine," Jonathan said, already pretty sure of what those propositions would be. If he was not mistaken, the man would want him to stay in the town, and protect it. It was only up to Grainel to not push the matter, or try to force it on Jonathan. This town had been better than the others he had visited before, but he would not hesitate to leave if he was forced into anything. In any case, he was confident that he was strong enough to escape, if not defeat, the defenders of the town, especially with his new levels. Leaving the hubbub of the crowd behind, the old man led Jonathan down the main street, ignoring the many businesses and houses on each side. He walked at a slow pace, barely more than that of a normal human, and Jonathan had to resist the urge to tell the man to hurry up. Eventually, they reached the city center, finding themselves outside of a large building, built out of a different type of stone than the rest of the city. It was a lighter shade of black, almost a gray color, and it was quite a bit more inviting than the rest of the city. The mayor walked up to the doors, and placed his palm against a small pad on the side. The pad beeped and went green, and the doors opened in front of him, revealing a large hallway. He waved at Jonathan, beckoning for him to enter, and he followed. Setting foot on the smooth floor of the city hall, Jonathan was amazed by how silent it was in comparison to the rest of the city. He followed the other man down the hallway, wondering why there was nobody else in the building. It seemed a little bit suspicious to him, but he was still confident in his power to deal with anything untoward. At the end of the hall was an ornate door, which the mayor opened using a key hanging from a chain around his neck. Behind the door was a well-furnished study, with sofas, and even a wooden table. Jonathan had no idea where all of the finery had come from, seeing as they were literally in hell, but he did not ask questions. The other man entered the room, sitting down behind the desk. Jonathan entered after him a moment later, surveying the room. "Do you like the desk? I found it a nice touch. I had it imported from the Ashen Citadel a few years back. It was quite expensive, but worth it, I feel. It gives me bonuses to my writing speed, which is getting worse in my old age." Noting that Jonathan was still standing, he waved his hands. "Sit, please. This isn't a job interview. You are a hero to us now." Jonathan nodded and sat on one of the sofas, watching the other man closely. "I don't mean to be rude, but what exactly did you summon me here for?" "Ah, don't be so formal. I didn't summon you anywhere. This is merely a friendly chat. Nothing more, nothing less." Then the other shoe dropped. "I have a proposition for you, you see, and I wish to make it in private." "Go on. I saw your performance out there, on the battlefield, and I wish to make use of your power in the future. How would you feel about becoming a permanent citizen of this town, with a full salary and the best of comfort?" "Not interested," Jonathan replied instantly. "I have a task to complete, and I cannot linger long here, no matter what you might offer to me. However, is there anything else you might want from me?" "Look," the other man began, sighing, "I wish I didn't have to explain this to you. I am quite popular among the general populace, but some of the crafters wish to oust me. You see, I installed a tax a few years ago on the wealthiest members of this town, and they wish to remove me, and place a puppet in my place. I would be grateful if you helped me out with this. Why would you enact such a tax? Was it to line your own pockets? Jonathan asked, expecting nothing less. For this man to be actually a good person was quite unlikely. Believe it or not, I love the people of this town like my own family. I built this place out of my own blood, sweat and tears, back when I was a young man, and I enjoy watching what it became. With those taxes, I make sure that everyone is able to eke out a passable existence here, no matter how destitute they are. I cannot provide much, but it is better than nothing. The man's tone indicated that he was telling the truth, but was hiding something. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, regarding the man with a lidded gaze. During his years back on Earth, he had dealt with many people like this, generally when he was trying to negotiate a good deal for supplies. He worked for a small company that had been in the business of transporting goods across the country, working for their parent company, which was a large retailer. For some reason, they had put Jonathan on the job of negotiating with the suppliers to get a better deal than simply buying from a quota. He had been quite good at it too, and one of the best ways to crack someone's facade was to stay silent. Most people would be unable to stand the uncomfortable break in the conversation, and would eventually fill it with something else. Apply this enough, and it was a great boon to any negotiation. It only took him a few minutes to crack the mayor, and the man gulped nervously. Fine. I do take a small cut myself, but only because of the service that I render to the town. That money paid for this desk, which is an inarguable boon to the entire town, as it meshes with my class to allow me to administer the daily tasks of my job more quickly. That wasn't so hard, was it now? Jonathan asked. Seeing as you have so much spare money, I assume that you can reward me for my services, if I decide to help you out. Now that Jonathan knew how much things cost, he was hungry for more coinage, with which to buy supplies. He was already well equipped, but seeing as enchanted items were able to provide small stat bonuses, he wanted to find more. The other man grimaced slightly at the demand, but he nodded. I'll draw up a proper system quest for you. One of the perks of my class, the other man said that he pulled out a piece of paper, and began scribbling on it. True to his word, it did indeed seem like he was writing at a furious pace. A few minutes later, he took the piece of paper, and handed it to Jonathan. As he read it, he was met with a notification. You have been offered a quest. Municipal discontent C. The town mayor is in quite a predicament, and he wished for you to help him out. The town's elite are angry at him for enacting taxes on them, with which to benefit the town, and occasionally his own pocket. Despite this, he has remained in power for long enough to hire you. Quite lucky of him. You have been tasked with quelling this discontent, whether through negotiation or through force. Rewards, 100 Leviathan coins. Accept. Y/N. It was a simple quest, with a simple reward, and Jonathan quickly accepted it, causing the other man to smile. Like with the baby killer quest, it was a one-stage quest, meaning that there was no objective section like there had been with the Hellbreaker quest. Good. You should get to work as soon as possible then, as the next monster wave should be coming within the day. Jonathan nodded at the mayor, and walked out the door, not noticing the devious smile on the other man's face. Perhaps he had been using the taxes to benefit the people, but they were really an excuse for his greatest vice. The mayor, like quite a few people in the ash heaps, was addicted to a certain type of drug that was sourced directly from the Ashen Citadel. It was formed out of the byproduct of the soul-consuming process that Granath used on the damned souls entering his city, and it would allow the user to experience the memories of the person who had produced it. Seeing as their minds had been broken before even reaching the hells, all that was left were their memories of the outside world. This was the only form of escape that anyone in this world could find, and the drug had an highly addictive quality too. The mayor wasn't actually even that old, just wizened from overexposure to the drug. It was expensive too, necessitating a steady stream of money to buy. Sure, the merchants were angry at the man for this vice of his, but they were mostly annoyed that the taxes were cutting into their bottom line. Like Jonathan had found, a good soul was rare indeed in the infinite hells. A few minutes later, Jonathan was standing outside of the nearest smithy, one that was richly appointed, and seemed like it belonged to someone with quite a lot of money to throw around. The building was covered in ornate decorations, made out of metal, and there were large windows, displaying a series of weapons and armor, all of which looked quite finely constructed. There was a line outside the smithy too, with about a dozen people waiting. Upon seeing Jonathan, however, they quickly made way for him, chattering excitedly among each other. He nodded his thanks, and entered the smithy. The interior was even more ostentatious than the outside, with what looked to be an actual carpet in the waiting area. Jonathan made his way up to the desk, prompting the man sitting there to look up. He was of a race that Jonathan had never seen before, but he did recognize it from some less than appropriate shows back on Earth. The man looked like a normal human, but he had the ears of a cat, and had feline features as well, with eyes that glowed slightly. Whiskers protruded out from under his nose, and he frowned at Jonathan. "What are you staring at? You have something against my kind?" "No, you merely reminded me of something," Jonathan said, wondering why he was even bothering explaining. "I have business with your boss. Can you direct me to him? Master Garneth does not deal personally with the likes of you. You can either leave an order for him here, or get out." Jonathan had been hoping to do this diplomatically, but the man's tone was rubbing him the wrong way. He sighed, and walked past the desk, heading towards the forge in the back room. "Hey! You can't go in there." Jonathan ignored the cat man, and kept walking. He heard a hiss from behind him, and something impacted his back, without enough force to break through his armor. He turned around slowly, and saw that the desk attendant was clutching a crossbow in his hands. Jonathan growled, a low, terrifying noise, and a wave of power surged out of him, cowing the other man. It was the same feeling that he had felt from the monstrous reptile that had almost killed him, but this time it was coming from him. A growing stain across the front of the other man's pants alerted Jonathan to his effect on him, and he turned around, disgusted. There were no more crossbow bolts after that. He was glad that he had not injured the other man, as he felt no pleasure in harming those who were weaker than himself. There was no way to gain power from that, after all. Perhaps if he murdered thousands of people lower level than him, he could gain levels, but although he acted in a brutal manner against his enemies, Jonathan was not evil. Part of his desire to leave the hells after all was to be able to free all of the lost souls here. Still, it was all well and good to be espousing his morals here, but he knew that things would probably change if he ever made it past this ring. Eventually, he suspected that his morals would be tested, but for now, he was powerful enough to actually follow his desired path. He entered the back room a few seconds later, finding himself wandering to the middle of an expanse of sweltering heat. Emaciated workers shoveled coals into an endlessly burning forge, and other workers brought tools to a giant of a man who was working in the middle of the forge. Jonathan frowned upon seeing the state of the workers, but he withheld his judgment, at least until he could find more. Upon hearing him enter, a marvel, given the noise that the constant ringing of the man's hammer was making, he turned around, facing Jonathan. "What do you think you're doing here, you bastard? You dare to come disturb my work? I ought to crush you for that." The man blustered. Jonathan ignored his angry words, and instead studied the man. He looked human enough, but he had a certain rough-hewn quality to his features that told Jonathan that he was not entirely so. He quickly analyzed the man. Forge Master Garneth. Half-troll. Level 32. The man was a half-troll, which explained the size. In addition, he was of a higher level than Jonathan, but he suspected that the man would not hold up to him in a real fight, which seemed to become more of a possibility as time went on. "Did that worm of a mayor send you here to interfere with my work? Pathetic. That man is far too weak to be in charge." "That depends. Who are these people, and why are they in such bad condition?" Jonathan asked, pointing at the workers. The other man sneered at this. These wretches? Why, they are my slaves. Does that cause you offense? I can see that you do not treat them with the respect that they deserve. I was going to let you off with a warning to not interfere in the workings of this town, but it seems like we have a problem, Jonathan said, folding his arms. He would not abide this sort of evil, no matter whether it was his place to stop it or not. The other man laughed, long and low, and drew a massive hammer from his belt. It seems like we do, he said, starting to pump fiery energy into the hammer. The slaves scattered, and the forge master lumbered forwards, crossing the distance between himself and Jonathan deceptively quickly. He brought his hammer down, and the air rang with the speed at which it traveled. Jonathan stepped to the side and slapped the hammer to the ground, where it left a massive crater, blasting chunks of rock in all directions. Some of those rock chunks struck the slaves, injuring them. Jonathan's rage started to burn hotter. He grabbed the handle of the hammer, but was forced to let go, as his flesh started to blister. You filth! I may be a blacksmith, but I am more than strong enough to defeat you. The man swiped his hammer up and towards Jonathan's face, surprising him with the speed at which it moved. He snapped his arms up to protect his head, and blocked the strike. Even with the awkward angle at which it had traveled, it still cracked bones. However, it was not enough to keep Jonathan down. Jonathan skidded backwards, keeping his feet, and laughed at the other man. Mana surged to his fingertips, and his mana drills came into being, lighting up his form. With a single step, he was in front of the massive forge master, and he swung his fist into the man's gut. The leather apron that he was wearing evaporated around the mana drill, and Jonathan's gauntlet quickly thudded into flesh. The giant of a man was lifted off his feet, and was sent sprawling into the forge. He quickly got his feet underneath him, but Jonathan was already there. Lifting up one hand, he grabbed the smith's neck, and lifted him off the ground. The massive man writhed in his grasp, but Jonathan was too strong for him. You will release these slaves, at this moment, or I will kill you. If I ever heard that you have continued in this foul trade of flesh, I will come here, and end you. Is that understood? Jonathan placed all of his conviction, cultivated through battle, into his words, and let his aura flare out in full. The smith nodded, terrified, and Jonathan dropped the man, letting him drop to the floor. You lot, Jonathan said, addressing the slaves. You're all free to go. Go check in with the mayor, and tell him that his employee sent you. It was only fair that the mayor dealt with the backlash of the errands that he was sending Jonathan on. The slaves nodded wordlessly, and then ran out the door, startling the people waiting in line. Jonathan reached down and dragged the broken smith to his feet, and punched him in the jaw, knocking the man out. That was for the slaves, you bastard. Then Jonathan walked out after the fleeing slaves. He hadn't had the chance to warn the other man about his rebellious behavior, but he assumed that the smith wouldn't be causing any trouble after that. Leaving a line of confused townspeople standing behind him, Jonathan left the smithy, not sparing a single glance back. Hey, what was that all about? One of the people waiting asked. We heard fighting in there. Let's just say, you might be waiting for a bit longer, Jonathan replied, smiling. Before the man could say anything, Jonathan was off, heading towards the next of the well-off businesses. The nearest one seemed to be some sort of tailor's establishment, and Jonathan noted that there was a line in front of this place too. As to why people would be looking for clothes in the middle of a monster wave, he could not tell. He quickly shouldered past the people, and entered the shop. Somebody called after him in outrage, but he ignored it. The front part of the shop was quite nice, with rows of clothing racks and shelves filled with hats and other accessories. A young woman sat behind a desk at the end of the room, tallying up something on a piece of paper. Jonathan walked over to the girl, and cleared his throat. Is your boss in? He asked, ready to barge past if necessary. The mistress is here today. Do you have an appointment with her? No, but I have something important to tell her. I was sent by the mayor himself. The woman frowned at this, but she still nodded. The mistress and the mayor aren't exactly on the best of terms at the moment. None of the prominent crafters are. You can still see her though. Well, as long as she doesn't have any slaves, or is running some sort of racket in here, all that will happen is talk. Otherwise. Jonathan slid past the woman and into the back section of the shop. She gave him a look, but did not challenge him. That was good. He would not have wanted to do anything emotionally scarring to her, like he had to the cat man back at the smithy. When he had left, he had seen that man cowering in a corner, making strange noises to himself under his breath. There was a large door behind the desk, and Jonathan knocked on it loudly. He heard feet scurrying towards the door, and it was quickly opened by an out-of-breath woman who was clutching a half-made shirt in her hands. Jonathan walked past her and into the room, taking in its inhabitants. There were about a dozen women and men, mostly women though, working at looms. They were in the process of creating clothes and their fingers veritably flew across their looms, the lines of cloth quickly forming, as if out of nothing. It was quite satisfying to watch, if nothing else. Jonathan studied each of them in turn, but they all seemed quite happy to be there, and they barely looked up at him. He nodded, and entered the room fully, seeing a woman sitting behind a large table at the end of the room. She was dressed in simple enough clothing, but it sparkled in a way that was not entirely natural. The clothes seemed to draw the eye, far more so than the woman's actual appearance, which was middling to say the least. She was middle-aged, probably about 50, and was of the human race, or at least a humanoid one. She looked up when Jonathan drew near, a bemused smile on her face. "Who exactly are you, sir?" she asked, sounding politely annoyed. "That depends. Are you one of the crafters demanding the mayor to lower the taxes in the city? So that old bastard put you up to this, did he? Well, did he tell you about what he actually uses that money for?" she asked, her polite demeanor gone, replaced with a tense scowl. "He said that he used it for the betterment of the city," Jonathan replied, intrigued. "Lies. Utter lies. That man uses it to satisfy his addiction to memory stone, some foul drug from the Ashen Citadel. He may put a bit back into the city, but why should we pay for his addiction? Memory stone? He didn't tell me about that," Jonathan replied, starting to doubt whether his assessment of the mayor was correct. "Of course he didn't. What did he offer you, money or something? You fell for it, hook, line and sinker. I will not change my mind on this, not even if you try to force me. I don't expect you to. However, if I convince the mayor to stop using the money for an ill purpose, would you be willing to pay adequate taxes then? If you could do that, that would be a minor miracle. I would be happy to pay for the betterment of the city. However, I doubt that many of the other crafters will. I fear that they enjoy their filthy lucre just a bit too much. Some of them even have slaves now, to better save money. A despicable practice. I already dealt with one of them." "So, do I have your agreement?" Jonathan asked, his face flat. "That you do. However, I would watch out with what you say to the mayor. It is an open secret that the agents of the Ashen Citadel are quite prevalent within the city. If you start interfering with their clients, you might be in for a rough time." "I think I can deal with a few people," Jonathan said, turning back towards the exit. He had achieved more than he had set out to do here, not only having secured this woman's support without having to resort to violence, but also finding out more about the injustices being committed in this town. Let the Ashen Citadel agents come for him. It was time for him to learn a bit more about the forces of Granath anyway. If that learning was delivered through the red haze of battle, all the better. A few minutes later, he was back outside of the city hall, hoping that the mayor was still in. Jonathan walked up to the door, and knocked on it 3 times, his strikes resounding through the interior of the hall. He waited a few moments, and then knocked again, this time prompting an answer. "I'm coming. I'm coming. Wait a moment." The door opened, and Jonathan beheld the mayor, who had a strange silvery substance dotting his clothing. It would not have been noticeable to a normal human, but Jonathan's senses were far sharper than what was natural. So, is it true then? The memory stone? Jonathan asked, putting his foot in the door. This proved to be the right decision, as the mayor tried to slam the door. Jonathan's foot did not budge. I take it that it is. Well, I have come to believe that the crafters are not the only problem in this town. Why are you spending the hard-earned money of the citizens on your personal enjoyment? You don't understand, the mayor said, looking as if he were about to cry. It is the only way out of this place for me. I need the escape that the drug offers, even if it is killing me. Why is it killing you? Jonathan asked, curious. How old do I look to you? 70, 80. What if I told you that I was only 40 years old? Jonathan had been of the impression that the other man had been more in the vicinity of 90 years of age, but it was still just as shocking. The fact that the wrinkled, destitute wreck of a man in front of him was only about 10 years older than himself was stunning. Despite that, Jonathan could feel no pity for the mayor. He had brought this upon himself with his own depredations. It was what he got for stealing from the townspeople. Jonathan pushed the door open abruptly, and forced his way past the mayor, placing himself between the man and the rest of the building. As the man tried to run, Jonathan shot out his hand and grasped him by the arm. The mayor shouted in alarm as Jonathan dragged him back inside the building, slowly shutting the door. There had been no witnesses, which was perfect. He half dragged, half carried the wayward politician back towards his room at the far end of the city hall, and upon reaching the ornate door, he pulled the key off the man's neck and opened it. As they entered, he set the mayor down, who walked over to his desk, in a dazed state. Jonathan ignored the man, instead searching the room for anything with the same traces of residue that had been on the mayor. He eventually found something, a small box that was liberally dusted with powder. Upon opening it, he found nothing inside, but his sharp eyesight noticed that there was an infinitesimal seam at the bottom of the box, which he placed his fingernail in. Lifting it up, he found a thin layer of white powder at the base of the box, beneath the false bottom. It glistened in the light, and Jonathan danced that he could see someone moving within the shards, dancing under a yellow sun. He quickly shook his head, and put the lid back on, turning to face the mayor. Now, I believe it is time for you and I to have a little chat about the future of this town, Jonathan said, leaning over the mayor. What do you mean? I have been nothing but a good mayor to these people. The other man spluttered, trying to conceal his fear. How much of the tax revenue of this town have you spent on this drug? Jonathan asked, waving the box at the other man. Not much. Just about 10%. It was only a tiny investment, nothing more. You still don't understand how much I need it, the other man said, his voice turning wistful at the end. He then stared at the box that Jonathan was holding, twitching slightly. Jonathan shook his head, and smashed the box over his knee, scattering the dust all over the room. A few pieces got into his mouth, and he had a strange flash of memory, a memory that was not his. It vanished as quickly as it had come, but the legacy of that image was still in his mind. He shook his head, and cleared his mind. He could not afford to become addicted to the drug as well. The mayor let out a keening screech of anguish as the dust scattered all over the room, beyond reach. He leapt out of his chair and tried to catch it out of the air, but it was useless. All he achieved was a light dusting on his hands, which he still tried to use anyway. All that happened was that his body jerked for a moment, and then he snapped back to reality. Now that that is out of the way, I have a proposition for you. It seems that a few of the crafters are interested in paying their taxes, as long as you do not spend their money on illicit purchases. Everything has to be over the counter. The other man did not speak, rocking from side to side of his chair, a haunted look in his eyes. Jonathan continued regardless. In addition, I will require your help in rooting out your suppliers within this town. If you help me with that, I will not oppose your rule, unfit though you are. Do you understand me? You took her away from me. My beloved, the mayor said, still rocking back and forth. She was all I had left. Who? Jonathan asked. The woman in the memories. She was the wife of whoever's soul it had come from, back on Telveria. Oh, to be back in the real world, just for a moment. To feel the sun on my face, to trail my feet in the verdant meadows once more. To feel the wind on my skin, even to see a proper city. Not this half-world of dreams and lies that I am trapped in. Well, you're just going to have to deal with it, Jonathan replied, not feeling even an ounce of pity. One of his old friends, back from college, had gotten into drugs early in his life, and while Jonathan and him had slowly drifted apart, he had been keenly aware of the downward spiral that the man had gone through. First, he had broken up with his girlfriend, after she confronted him over his habits. Then he started to commit minor crimes to buy more drugs, as nobody would hire him. Finally, he ended up overdosing on the side of the street, and Jonathan had eventually forgotten about him, not even remembering his name. However, the memories were all coming back now, and it only made him angrier at not only the mayor, but the people supplying the drug. While the addict was partly at fault, the brunt of the problem lay with the suppliers. In any case, Jonathan would have to excise both in this situation in order to have any sort of impact. The only problem was that he doubted if the mayor was the only person in the town using the memory stone. If suppliers had come through these parts, then they were likely selling to far more people than just one man, even if he had most of the money. Jonathan sat back and began to think of a course of action for this. The next monster wave would be coming soon, meaning that he did not have any time to do investigation. There was always the option of packing up and leaving after the waves were done, but he had a strange compulsion to linger here and help, perhaps triggered by the kindness of Petrag and his daughter, the only good people in town. He nodded to himself, and then finalized the plan. He would need to be stealthy, which meant that he needed the mayor's cooperation in this endeavor. If the suppliers got antsy, then the whole thing would be off. In all of the undercover agent shows that Jonathan had watched back on Earth, the most important thing, above even blending in, was to keep a low profile. He would need to remain unseen until the last moment, when he would strike. There was also the possibility that the suppliers would be stronger than him, which he found unlikely. In that eventuality, however, he would have to separate them. Knowing how the power structures of this world worked, he was quite confident in facing anyone with a basic class that was up to 10 levels higher than him. Past that, it wasn't really a question of stats anymore, but one of skills. All right. I have a plan, but I will need your cooperation. I do not want to have to tell you what will happen if you do not go along with this. All I need is for you to sit tight here until the next monster wave ends, and not to do anything untoward. If the dealers come around, act normally, and tell them that you don't need any more of the supply. Got it? The other man slowly nodded his head, looking as if he was barely conscious. Jonathan nodded, and left the room, heading out towards the streets. He emerged into the same bustling crowd that he had seen during the beginning of the previous monster wave, and he quickly let himself be dragged along with them towards the walls. He did not have his crossbow anymore, but as he approached the walls, somebody handed him a normal bow instead. It was a shoddy piece of work, but it seemed sturdy enough, and Jonathan quickly accepted a quiver full of arrows as well. Walking up the stairs, hemmed in on both sides, Jonathan began to hear the telltale rumbling noise of the monster horde. He made it to the top of the wall just in time to see the wave of black crest the horizon, and he heard the townspeople around him swallow nervously. This wave was even larger than the previous one, and the monsters seemed a little bit bigger too. In addition, there was a strange, shadowy shape lumbering behind the main part of the horde, something that Jonathan couldn't identify. He began to prepare, knocking his bow. He found it far more difficult than using the crossbow had been, and only managed it at all because of his preternatural agility. Soon he was waiting, with the bow string pulled back, and his hand next to his ear. He was mimicking the others around him, and when the monster eventually came within range, he let go of the string. The arrow hissed forwards with the rest of the volley, striking an ash prowler at the front of the pack. Like before, the horde's momentum was barely diminished by the attack. Heavier attacks began to land among the monsters, with an entire boulder glowing with white light tearing great holes in the enemy lines. That explained why the enhancer had not come around to imbue the mundane weapons. He was doing a detail with the heavy weaponry instead. It seemed more effective too, given how densely packed the monsters were. It almost seemed as if they were running away from something. He kept his thoughts focused on his bow rather than letting them wander, and he quickly ran out arrows, his speed making him shoot far faster than anyone else on the walls. He withdrew, and looked for another quiver, and upon not finding one, he took a few arrows from another person, who was shooting far more slowly than him. Rather than be annoyed, the man smiled at Jonathan, likely thankful that some of his workload had been taken away. Jonathan nodded in return, and began to string his arrows again, loosing them into the horde. The monsters crashed into the wall a minute later, shaking it to its very foundations. Jonathan stumbled, and the entire wall began to shake, sending tiny bits of masonry off the sides. The monsters streamed around the town, howling in terror of what was behind them. Jonathan quickly took more arrows from the man next to him, and readied them for what was to come. A few minutes later, the last of the monsters were gone, and the ash cloud cleared, revealing an imposing monster trudging across the ash. It looked like a dark furred mammoth, with embers trailing in its wake. Its twin tusks were a fiery red color, and they glowed with heat to Jonathan's sight. It was double the height of a regular elephant, it had an imposing weight to it that made Jonathan wary. This was something that he would not be able to fight on his own. He quickly scanned the monster, along with the others around him. As wails of terror began to drift up, he read the description. Infernal Ash Mammoth, Boss. Level 50. No wonder the people were screaming. This monster was of an entirely different designation than anything Jonathan had ever seen before, and its level was higher than any monster he had faced, and won against. It trumpeted as it approached the walls, and its trunk began to glow as it built up an attack within it. A moment later, it raised its trunk into the air and sent off a fiery rocket of condensed energy towards the walls. The walls shook as it impacted them, and stone melted before the intense heat of the strike. Several people fell off the edge, landing on the ground. None of them had died from the attack, but they were quickly immolated by another fireball. The heavier weaponry turned to bear on the monster, and ballista bolts, glowing with white energy, lanced into the monster. It roared in rage as chunks of its flesh were blasted off by the attacks, and began to charge. The strikes had done noticeable damage, but not enough to even faze the monster. It slowly built up speed and power as it ran, and crashed into the wall mere seconds later. The entire thing buckled beneath the strike, but ultimately held before the onslaught. The monster reared back, and began to slam its tusks into the city wall, shaking it violently. More and more attacks lanced into its body, but the monster ignored them, instead focusing on its task. Jonathan set aside his bow, and began running towards the monster. He had an idea, but it was almost suicidal in nature. He reached the section of wall where the mammoth was, which was deserted by this point, and without pausing, he leaped onto its head. The monster barely noticed him, likely thinking him of no consequence. Well, Jonathan was about to prove it wrong. He gathered mana round his right fist, more than he had ever before, and condensed it so tightly that his nose began to bleed from the strain of holding it in place. As the attack built to a crescendo, Jonathan brought his fist down. A crater formed in the monster's head as the attack landed, and bits of flesh spattered across Jonathan. The mammoth wailed in pain, and began to shake, trying to get Jonathan off. He struck again and again, trying to dig down to its brain, where he could finally kill the monster. However, he quickly struck a problem, in the form of the monster's hard, bony skull. It was made out of a rock-like substance that was so strong that Jonathan could not break it, only melting small segments of it with his mana drill skill. The mammoth shook once more, and then began to uncurl its trunk, sending it telescoping up towards Jonathan. It glowed with heat as it unfurled, and snapped into place, facing Jonathan. He readied himself to leap, and as the trunk began to undulate, working the ball of fire along its length, he jumped up into the air. Some of his knuckles cracked and turned to powder, but he succeeded in making a hole in the monster's skull. More powerful attacks from the walls started to rain down on the monster, and he noticed that they were coming from the two mages who he had fought alongside earlier. Their bolts of mana were having little effect, but seeing as they were all landing in the same spots, the damage was steadily mounting. The mammoth bucked in pain, and swiped its trunk along the top of its head, knocking Jonathan to the side. He managed to stay on, but his trunk quickly curled around him, and the monster lifted him off its head. He struggled, but it was to no avail. The monster held him securely in its grip, and began to slam him into the wall, breaking his bones each time. Jonathan screamed in agony as the monster tried to break his body against the unyielding stone of the wall, and he found that there was only one way to get out of this situation. Quickly embracing his divinity, Jonathan glowed with a corona of golden light. As the monster slammed him into the wall again, he bent his legs, and pushed off it, knocking the trunk off course. The mammoth let go of him, shocked, and he flipped through the air, landing back on its head. His bones were shattered in multiple places, but his last-ditch skill was holding him together long enough to stay in fighting form. He began to pummel the monster's weakened skull with a steady barrage of punches, imbued with mana. The beast bucked beneath him, but he held on, and began to break through the rapidly weakening skull, heading for its brain. Someone shouted at him from the wall, and he looked up to see the enhancer mage tossing a large rock towards him, imbued with his power. Jonathan nodded and backed away, before striking out with the speed of a snake, slamming the rock into the monster's skull. It exploded, tearing away the final fragments of the broken skull, and Jonathan leapt forwards, before sending a pulse of mana into the monster's brain. It fell sideways, dying, and he found himself swaying on his feet. A moment later, blackness claimed him. Jonathan came to in a strange room, one that seemed as if it had been built to house prisoners. There was only one tiny window, and the door was quite sturdy. He was lying on a cot, and a man was hovering over him, whispering something under his breath. The man's face was illuminated with green light, coming from his hands, and it seemed that he was healing Jonathan's extensive wounds. He had leveled up from the monster, twice in fact, but the scope of his injuries had been so extensive that they had not healed fully. Landing on the ground under part of the monster had not helped his state either. Upon seeing that he was up, the man stood up and ran out the door, leaving Jonathan lying on the bed. He tried to get up, but a spike of pain running through his left side dissuaded him, and he collapsed backwards, his mind racing. Had he been imprisoned here, his weakness taken advantage of? Or was this all an honest scenario, and he was merely being healed from his injuries? A few minutes later, the healer returned, with two men. Jonathan did not recognize either of them, but they had significant auras of power to them, and Jonathan stiffened as he saw what was under their hoods. Both of the men had ashen skin, and had small horns on their foreheads. They were most assuredly demons, perhaps the very servants of Granath that had been distributing the memory stone in the area. They both walked over to his bedside, and one of them cleared his throat. "We are interested in your potential, Jonathan, and we have an offer for you. We are the servants of the lord of this land, Granath, and we feel that you would make a valuable asset within his legions." "I'm not interested," Jonathan said. He tried to keep the open hostility out of his voice, but some of it remained regardless. "You would do well to watch your tone, boy," the other of the demons said. "We are not men that you would want to have as enemies. That doesn't change the fact that I am not interested in serving Granath. I am my own man." "Well, your attitude might change eventually. You will soon realize the futility of your struggle. Many are like you, thinking that they can live a passable life here, but the true wonders of this world are guarded by Granath and are only available to his followers. In any case, I await your acceptance." The two men walked out the door after that, and the healer shuddered. That was not a wise move. Those men will not give up on you now. You only piqued their interest. Do you not realize who you just snubbed? The man asked. Yeah, a giant, demonic worm. I don't have respect for Granath, and I never will. He is a blight upon this land. The healer recoiled in shock, and shook his head. Don't say things like that here. You'll bring the Master's wrath down on my head. We are only here at Lord Granath's pleasure. If he decides that this city is filled with discontent, he will erase it from the map. The man quickly scurried away, as if he had been infected by Jonathan's blasphemy. Jonathan shook his head, and opened his stat sheet, eager to see how much he had improved. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 1. Human, Basic. Outsider, Tier 1. Level 30. 45 free points. Strength. 144. Dexterity. 95. Constitution. 99. Resilience. 99. Intelligence. 99. Wisdom. 99. Divinity. 2. Health 570/990. Stamina 2160/2160. Mana 990/990. Titles. Chosen of Sarnathros, unique. Nascent Divinity, celestial. Righteous Killer, rare. Underdog, rare. Skills. Smite, legendary. Unravel, epic. Mana Drill, rare. Focused Scry, rare. Runes of Power, rare. Meditation, uncommon. Redirect, uncommon. Identify, common. Pathway Skills. Martial Arts, Student 4. Mana Manipulation, Student 4. Runecrafting, Student 3. True Sight, Student 1. Quests. Hellbreaker, Impossible. Municipal Discontent C. Almost all of his stats were at the verge of a breakthrough, and he did not particularly enjoy the idea of doing so. However, he really didn't have a choice. He quickly placed 3 stat points into dexterity, bringing it up to 99 as well. He closed his eyes, trying, and failing, to prepare himself for what was to come. The first order of business was probably to rank up Constitution, seeing as it would most likely heal him from his injuries. Taking a deep breath, he placed a single point into the stat. Immediately, his flesh began to swell beneath his skin, stretching it out past its breaking point. Blood spurted over the bed as Jonathan writhed in silent agony, as his tongue had grown too large for him to keep in his mouth. Every part of him, except for his skin and his bones, expanded, and his body crushed itself on the inside of his skeleton, causing lances of pure pain to shoot up and down his body. It ended barely a half-minute later, with the expanded flesh shrinking to its normal size, and the skin healed over as if it had never been damaged. Jonathan quickly opened the notification. You have passed the first threshold of Constitution. Constitution is your body's ability to take damage, but not its ability to mitigate it. Many believe that this concept, and that of resilience, are one and the same, but they are quite different. Those who use this stat as their guiding star soon find that pain is the only end of their path. Pain, and near immortality. Jonathan closed the notification, and began to work himself up for another threshold, perhaps one of the mental ones this time. They couldn't hurt as much as the physical ones, right? He realized that he had been fully healed, as to his intention, and he got out of the bed, making his way over to the door. There was nobody outside, and he quickly returned to the center of the room, preparing to rank up his intelligence stat. It would make his mana attacks much stronger than before. Quickly adding the point, Jonathan felt nothing different than before. He looked around himself in confusion, and then as he began to see behind the world around him, his mind started to fracture. Everything near him became a source of profound insight, sending tidal waves of information crashing into his brain. There was no physical pain, but the mental anguish was far worse. Jonathan writhed on the floor as his mind was forcibly expanded, and he could feel his mana core expanding within him as well. Some time later, the process came to a sudden halt, and he was left shuddering on the ground. You have passed the first threshold of intelligence. Intelligence is one's ability to comprehend the world around them, and to parse the endless streams of information that come hurtling through one's consciousness. The greater one's intelligence, the greater their mental abilities become. However, without wisdom, intelligence is useless. If one possesses all the knowledge in existence, but lacks the knowledge of how to use it, then do they not simply know nothing at all? Jonathan paused on that last line, which was strangely philosophical. It certainly had a grain of truth to it in any case. Jonathan had 3 more stats to enhance, 2 of which were physical stats. He deliberated on which of them to do next, eventually deciding on resilience. Perhaps it would render the subsequent thresholds less painful. With a single thought that would trigger a mountain of pain, he placed the point into the stat. He looked down at his body, and started to scream as his flesh tore apart and reformed in a seemingly endless cycle. The cycle began to dig deeper and deeper into his body, until he could see through his limbs as they broke and reformed. Soon the pain became all-consuming, but he was unable to escape, with even his brain being rebuilt. All that was left of him was a disembodied consciousness. The process ended some time later, and he returned to his body, shaking and gasping for breath. The notification appeared, but he had to wait for a minute to open it. His mind was aflame with memories of the pain, and he cursed himself for having waited until all of the thresholds were imminent. He should have done them in sequence. Still, it was too late now. He opened the notification a moment later, and read it. You have passed the first threshold of resilience. Resilience comes in many forms. Physical resilience, the ability of the body to resist damage. Mental resilience, the ability of the mind to deal with things that would break lesser beings. Spiritual resilience, the ability to remain hopeful when your entire world is crashing down around you. All 3 are equally important, and this threshold has tested them in equal measure. Just remember, there is a problem with being too rigid. Jonathan took a deep breath, and lay on his back. He was past the halfway mark, but the finish line was looking more distant than it had ever before. Jonathan waited for another 10 minutes until he mustered the courage to break through with the next stat, which was dexterity. Placing one of his stat points into it, he was already prepared for the searing pain that was to come. His muscles started to burn and elongate, similar to his strength threshold. His entire body started to stretch outwards, and he was soon a long rope of flesh and muscles, with his bones interspersed along it. He felt all of the pain of his transformation, and he could barely contain a scream that bubbled up at the back of his hideously elongated throat. He snapped back like a piece of gum a moment later, and was whole once more. You have passed the first threshold of dexterity. Dexterity. Alacrity. The ability to adapt. These are all parts of the same concept, that of an ability to react to change. Whether of the physical or mental variety, change is most often seen as an existential threat. However, those who are adept in the ways of dexterity see it as an opportunity as well. An opportunity to embrace the full meaning of themselves. Jonathan's vision came in intermittent bursts as his mind struggled to deal with the trauma. The human mind could only take so much pain before it shut down, and Jonathan was rapidly approaching that level. With one last Herculean effort of will, he slammed a point into wisdom. Immediately, he was filled with such incredible regret that he could barely move. Going through the wisdom threshold was akin to having every one of your actions analyzed in full detail, and then having everything that you did wrong laid bare in front of you, without the defense of your ego. Even worse, Jonathan knew that what he was seeing was right. He had made so many mistakes since coming here, and in his past life, that when they were laid out in front of him, he almost lost the will to live. His hands started to twitch, heading for his throat, and he almost didn't stop himself. It would be so easy for him to send a mana drill straight into his brain and end his suffering. Even worse, the tide of regret was only getting stronger as time went on, and he was beginning to lose all hope. Finding a kernel of inner strength that he did not realize he possessed, Jonathan held on for dear life. Finally, the surge abated, and he blacked out. Jonathan awoke to a tide of notifications, swamping the edge of his consciousness. He was still lying on the cold stone floor, having fallen unconscious there some time ago. The first notification was for his threshold. You have passed the first threshold of wisdom. Wisdom is one of the most important aspects of a person's psyche. With it, one can make balanced choices, and make their way through the vagaries of life without losing their balance. Without it, everything becomes much harder. A single wrong decision spirals into an apocalyptic tide of failures that can swamp even the most powerful of beings. Beware that does not become you. Jonathan shut the notification with his mind, and read the next one. You have gained a new title. Refined Form Epic. You have passed all of your initial thresholds, improving your body and mind by a large amount. This will lead to greater power at a greater rate. +2 to all stats. There was another one below it that was even more interesting. You have upgraded your race. Human, Advanced. You gain an additional stat point per level on account of your upgraded body. In addition, your senses are greatly improved. Because of reaching this level before level 50, as well as the great personal suffering that you went through, you have retroactively gained the points from your previous levels. On the surface, it was a nice boost, but not one that seemed especially good. However, because of the second half of the effects, it was worth its weight in gold. Jonathan had just gained 10 levels worth of free points from one simple process. Well, it hadn't been that simple, but it had been far quicker than just leveling up. A niggling doubt had gnawed at him since choosing to not pass through his thresholds until he had no choice. However, that had borne fruit now. After that notification was a second title notification, this one for something that Jonathan had no intention of experiencing again. You have gained a new title. Iron Will Epic. You have endured trials that would break the minds of lesser men, coming out the other side stronger than ever before. You are a paragon of true resolve, standing strong in the face of adversity. +3 to all physical stats. With all of these boosts, Jonathan was looking forward to opening his stat sheet again. However, before he could do so, the door burst open, and a heavily armored fighter strode in, flanked by the two demons from earlier. So this is the one who refused our offer. The armored man said to the demons, looking Jonathan over with a critical eye. He doesn't look like much. Barely level 30. Why would you even want him to join our little posse? We would be better off killing him now. He showed great promise on the city walls earlier. He was part of the team that dealt with the Infernal Ash Mammoth earlier. A level 50 boss tier monster. That is an impressive feat, even if all of his bones were broken from it, the left-hand demon said, his voice oily. It was clear where the power dynamic in this group lay. Jonathan quickly analyzed the armored man, taking advantage of a lull in the conversation. Ralnax the Breaker. Level 55. Jonathan gulped at the sight of the superior level, but then realized that he was in no danger, not unless this man was even stronger than he appeared, which was, to be frank, quite strong indeed. Jonathan staggered to his feet, feeling more powerful than he had ever felt before. I'm right here, you know. I came here to kick your little group out of this city, so I'll be damned if I join you, he exclaimed, spitting at the armored man. The other man took the slight in stride, wiping the saliva off his armor with his hand. Then he growled. You are going to regret that, worm. Without a moment's warning, the man surged forward, cracking the floor with his heavy stride. Jonathan took a step back, and then punched with all of his might, finding every last one of his newly improved attributes sending his fist on a collision course with the other man's head. Ralnax froze for a moment, not having expected such power from Jonathan. That moment let Jonathan get in the hit, slamming his gauntlet fist straight into the armored abdomen of Ralnax. With a creaking noise, the metal bent around the strike, and the man slammed into the wall, sending a long crack racing up and down the building. The other men cursed and ran for the door, not wanting anything to do with this clash of titans. Ralnax braced himself against the wall and pushed forwards, landing heavily. He held out his right arm, and a glowing axe started to form in his hand. The haft extended outwards, and he grasped it securely with his left hand, sending a ringing noise echoing through the narrow corners. Red, fiery light limned his form, and he charged, looking like some avatar of damnation. Mana formed on Jonathan's gauntlets, and he surged forwards, punching as hard as he could. Gauntlet and axe met in midair, and both fighters were frozen, unable to get any headway against one another. The stones beneath them started to crack from the sheer force they were exerting, but eventually something had to give. Jonathan's gauntlet gave first, and his hand twisted to the side, allowing the axe to come hurtling towards his head. He snapped up his other hand, and grabbed the axe by its haft, arresting its motion. The weapon phased out of existence, and then reappeared, this time between his arm and his head. There was no way for him to block in time, so he dodged instead. His new agility allowed him to move out of the way in time, only suffering a single wound on his left cheek as a result. Finding his balance in a fraction of a second, Jonathan kicked Ralnax in the knee, unbalancing the man. 3 punches landed in the span of a second, rocking the man back and forth. Ralnax snarled, and struck the ground with his weapon, sending a pulse of red light outwards, tossing Jonathan away and causing the building to finally give up the ghost and crumble into rubble. The sunlight streamed in through the cracks in the wall, and Jonathan quickly vaulted outwards. His fighting style was more suited to the open air anyway. Well, that wasn't strictly true, but with the supernatural agility and strength that he could bring to bear, his fighting style was quite far from any normal pugilist. He could move across a dozen feet in less than a second, punch hard enough to warp steel, and even jump far higher than a man was tall. As Ralnax broke through the rubble with a swipe of his axe, Jonathan was already upon the man, both fists glowing brightly with mana. One fist landed in the man's face, and another planted itself in his chest, rocketing him backwards. Ralnax grunted, and came to a halt, digging his axe into the ground. "You are far stronger than you should be for your level. What in the name of Granath are you?" the man asked, wiping the dust off his armor. "Would you believe me if I told you that I haven't even allocated all of my stat points yet?" Jonathan said, smiling wickedly. The other man shook his head, and dashed forward, hefting his axe as he did so. The ethereal weapon hissed through the air towards Jonathan, and he weaved to the side, slapping away the weapon with his gauntlet. Ralnax growled in annoyance and reversed his strike, using his prodigious strength to completely overcome the inertia of his strike. The weapon slammed into Jonathan's torso, thankfully only with the blunt bit, but it still hurt. He rolled backwards to mitigate the damage, and came to his feet just in time to tank a blast of red-hot fire from Ralnax's hand. The man seemed like he was some sort of elite among sapients, and he was certainly stronger than he would have been if he only had possessed a basic class. He probably had something more along the lines of Jonathan's own class, but not as powerful. People were starting to gather around the epicenter of their battle, and Jonathan could hear whispers coming from the rapidly growing crowd. He could almost pick them up too, showing off his newly enhanced senses from his racial upgrade. They were saying something about how it was him that would cleanse the city of the demonic scourge. Jonathan smiled at this, and took a solid stance, trying to hype himself up for the true battle to come. Neither fighter was even winded, and the real fight was just beginning. Jonathan slammed his gauntlets together, a ritual that he had begun to adopt when he was about to fight. He widened his stance, and built up power in his legs, before exploding forwards like a streak of silvery lightning. Jonathan slammed his fist into Ralnax's hastily upraised arm, pushing the man backwards. They were pretty evenly matched in strength, but Raunax still had a bit of an edge over Jonathan. Still, the momentum behind Jonathan's attack was sufficient to overwhelm the other man, and as Raunax staggered backwards, Jonathan punched with his other hand, rocking the other man backwards. The axe hissed out once more, but Jonathan was already gone, having flitted backwards a few feet. He was quite a bit faster than Raunax, especially with the man's heavy armor, but he was also a bit less durable. In any case, Jonathan was doing quite well, all things considered. He quickly imbued his fists with mana, and sent a barrage of punches Raunax's way. To him, it seemed like a normal attack, but most of the audience members could barely see it, and it merely looked like a flurry of blue strikes to them. Jonathan had transcended their level of strength when he broke through his thresholds, and was now on an entirely new level. Raunax was slowly pushed back, his axe doing him little good when he lacked the space to use it properly. Jonathan refused to give up his advantage, pressing his strength within a small space to his benefit. The axe that Raunax was wielding, while powerful, was too long to be used as a close-quarters weapon. Jonathan, on the other hand, was a close-quarters master. He bobbed and weaved around hasty strikes from the other man's axe hilt and gauntlets, sending devastating body blows crashing into Raunax. Raunax's armor slowly started to come apart before the barrage, melting with the superheated mana sent surging through it. Jonathan's fist connected moments after the mana, damaging the armor beneath. Soon, Raunax had had enough. He roared in rage, and slammed his axe down on the ground, sending out a shockwave of reddish light. Jonathan crossed his hands, but was still tossed backwards nonetheless. Raunax quickly recovered, and began to pump power into his axe, causing it to grow in size. The axe quickly became longer than Jonathan was tall, and Raunax swung it with all of his might, creating a wave of red energy that streaked towards Jonathan's position. The attack hit before he could dodge, and it passed straight through his chainmail, instead affecting his body on a spiritual level. Fiery agony burned within him, almost incapacitating him. The attack itself did no damage, but the pain was just as deadly in a battle like this. However, Jonathan was well versed in the ways of pain, and he quickly worked past the agony, just in time to roll away from Raunax's titanic axe. The weapon crashed into the ground like a meteor, digging out a large crater as it landed. If that thing hit Jonathan, it would do more than break bones. Jonathan would have to make sure that he did not get hit by that attack then. The only positive side was that the axe was far slower than before, in exchange for its immense power and large area of effect. He could get out of this, if he played his cards right. Raunax grunted as he lifted his axe, and Jonathan dashed underneath the rising blade, planting both mana-imbued fists into a weak spot on Raunax's armor. The man roared as Jonathan broke through the armor, landing a direct hit on the man's skin. Raunax grunted as Jonathan broke open his gray-tinged skin, sending a welter of blood spurting out onto the ground. Jonathan smiled, but then doubled over as he felt a similar attack slam into his own abdomen. Raunax laughed uproariously, using the opportunity to punch Jonathan in the face. "You fool! My armor is enchanted to reflect a portion of damage dealt to my bare skin back on the one who inflicted it. Seeing as you seem to be specced out for strength, you will die first. And that is if I do not kill you myself." Jonathan spat out blood and looked down at his stomach, seeing that the wound was even larger than the one that he had given Raunax. However, he had a counter to this. Quickly spending 20 of his stat points in batches of 2, he added another 30 points to resilience. His rounding technique ensured that he got the maximum benefit out of the stat point allocation. He could feel his skin getting tighter and more durable as he did this, and the wound on his stomach began to close over. Clenching his fist, he dove in again. Raunax did not try to stop him, instead laughing even more. However, this time, when Jonathan tore into the man's flesh, only a small amount of blood left his own. He grinned at the stunned Raunax, who stumbled backwards, in shock. "You should have listened to me when I said that I had stat points to allocate, asshole." With that, Jonathan beset the other man from all sides, not allowing him to use his weapon again. Soon the dark armor was crumbling in all places, and Jonathan finally broke it completely, revealing a stocky gray-skinned demon. "I'm coming for your master, you bastard, and all of the infinite hells. I am the Hellbreaker." Punching forwards, Jonathan caved in the other man's skull, turning it into a splatter of gore and bone fragments. Essence entered him, healing his myriad wounds. Notifications spiraled into his vision, and he quickly opened them. "You have killed Raunax the Breaker. You have leveled up, X2. He quickly closed that notification, and opened the next one, which was for a title. "You have upgraded one of your titles. Underdog, Rare the Giant Slayer, Epic. You took out a being over 25 levels higher than you. That is quite an impressive achievement, especially considering that it was a sapient being you defeated. This title can be upgraded. Bonuses, plus 10 points to strength, plus 5 points to resilience." After that one was a far more concerning message. "You have slain a being bearing the mark of Granath. Upon seeing you, and realizing who you are, followers of Granath will instantly attack you. However, you may thwart this effect with subterfuge." Jonathan closed that message, and then shrugged. It wasn't like he hadn't been planning to kill every follower of Granath that he found anyway. In fact, this could even prove to be useful, if he used it with sufficient strategy. He was about to open his stat sheet, but upon seeing all the people crowding around him, he decided to wait until he was in a more secure space. He would have to leave this town before long, in case anyone came looking for the missing Raunax. If they suspected that someone had killed him, they likely would send someone even stronger. Raunax had been a bit of a stretch, even for Jonathan, and if not for his leftover stat points, he probably would have died there. As it was, he has some things to look over on his stat sheet. A few minutes later, he was standing in a back alley, preparing to open his stat sheet. There was nobody around, save for a few rats scurrying around in the gutters. They were mutated, hideous rats, of course, but still recognizable as rats. Making sure one last time that he was alone, Jonathan opened his sheet. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 1. Human, Advanced. Outsider, Tier 1. Level 32. 50 free points. Strength. 160. Dexterity. 110. Constitution. 110. Resilience. 146. Intelligence. 110. Wisdom. 110. Divinity. 2. Health 1650/1650. Stamina 2400/2400. Mana 1650/1650. Titles. Chosen of Sarnathros, Unique. Nascent Divinity, Celestial. Iron Will, Epic. Refined Form, Epic. Giant Slayer, Epic. Righteous Killer, Rare. Skills. Smite, Legendary. Unravel, Epic. Mana Drill, Rare. Focused Scry, Rare. Runes of Power, Rare. Meditation, Uncommon. Redirect, Uncommon. Identify, Common. Pathway Skills. Martial Arts, Student 4. Mana Manipulation, Student 4. Runecrafting, Student 3. True Sight, Student 1. Quests. Hellbreaker, Impossible. Municipal Discontent C. Jonathan's stats were rapidly increasing, to the point that he had all of his resources in the thousands. In addition, with every threshold crossed, he was basically a superhero. Even better, he still had some spare points in the tank, meaning that he would be able to keep a reserve stock in case something like his battle with Raunax happened again. He couldn't help but contain the grin on his face as he closed his stat sheet. He was a far cry from the man that he had been upon entering the infinite hells. He was powerful enough to take out fighters almost double his level, and he was on the path of the greatest quest in the history of this universe. He was the Hellbreaker, and he would break the infinite hells. The next day was spent preparing for his challenges to come. The next monster wave would be coming soon, and now that he had dealt with the drug suppliers, he had fixed most of the problems with the city and the crafters' refusal to pay taxes. Most of the crafters had readily agreed to support the city, now that the mayor was no longer using his money on drugs. Jonathan had initially considered forcing the mayor to step down, but as it turned out, the man was extremely good at his job. He was the only person in the town who had a politically related class, meaning that he was far better at his job than anyone else would have been. In addition, after he had worked past the withdrawal symptoms of the drug, he had become a far more agreeable man than before. Jonathan left him to talk it over with the crafters. He had some extra money now from having completed his quest, and he needed to repair his armor. In addition, he wanted to get an upgrade for his gauntlets, in the form of an enchantment. He also had a plan for his gauntlets, but he wanted to try that after he had enchanted them, in case it backfired. If the weapons were more durable than before, then they were better equipped to resist what he was going to put them through. He had sent in his armor and gauntlets to Petrag a few hours ago, and was only now heading there to pick it up. He had paid a bit over 50 marks for the service, but he was anticipating something extraordinary. Walking in the door, he saw that Petrag was waiting for him, the dwarf covered in a thin layer of sweat. He held Jonathan's armor in one hand, and the gauntlets in the other. Jonathan quickly walked up, and gave the man a grateful smile. "Did it work out all right?" he asked. "Better than I could have expected. Those gauntlets were already quite powerful, but with the additions that I made to them, they should serve you well." Jonathan nodded and gently took his items from the smith. He held up his armor first, and analyzed it, having not done so already. Enchanted chainmail armor. Tier 1 armor, medium. An artfully crafted set of chainmail armor, this armor is imbued with the power of a journeyman smith, lending added durability to its form. In addition to this, it has a minor self-healing capability, and will clean itself too. +6 to resilience, +6 to constitution while wearing. Jonathan quickly donned the armor, welcoming the stat boost from it. A moment later, he analyzed his gauntlets, eager to see how they had improved. Marauder captains. Batterers. Tier 1 weapon, blunt. Twin dark iron gauntlets that are imbued with the spirit of a pugilist. These weapons are the perfect accompaniment to any martial path that eschews normal weaponry in favor of fighting in hand-to-hand combat. Using these weapons will even the gap, allowing you to fight against wielders of any other weapon. These gauntlets have been imbued with the power of a journeyman smith, adding extra durability and offensive potential to their form. +6 to strength, +6 to dexterity, +3 to resilience while wearing. Jonathan grinned as he read over the new bonuses. These would fit his needs perfectly. He quickly thanked the smith, and took his items out with him, forgetting to shut the door on the way out. He took them back to his alleyway from earlier, and set his gauntlets down on the ground in front of himself. Squatting down, he got to work. His idea was to create a rune of hatred on each gauntlet, which would hopefully increase the damage that they dealt. He would have to imbue them before he struck, but that was worth the damage that he could do. However, as he began to work, he had an even better idea. He would place one of each of the runes that he knew on the gauntlets, making one of them attract enemies, and the other one damage them. With that sort of combination, he could draw entire groups of enemies in and then strike with the other hand while they were distracted. He immediately made up his mind on the matter. That would be his course of action. He started to draw the rune of hatred on the knuckles of the right gauntlets, struggling to keep the rune stable as he did so. He lacked the precision to draw it small enough to fit on a single finger, meaning that he would have to line up the parts perfectly. The rune would only work if he punched with his fingers together, but seeing as that was his primary means of damage, it was fine. As he started to inscribe the rune with simple mud from the street around him, he worked to line up the complicated parts along the fingers. A few minutes later, he had finished, and was about to test it. Sliding the gauntlet on, he clenched his fist, and poured divinity into it. The gauntlet started to glow, and he punched at the wall. When his fist landed, a small nimbus of red light expanded outwards, fracturing the wall. He had only tapped the wall, but the damage was still quite imposing. In addition, it seemed that inscribing the rune on the gauntlet sacrificed some of its range for more stopping power, as it was now able to break things as well as kill enemies. Jonathan set down the gauntlet, and picked up the other one, this time inscribing the rune of beckoning on it. That rune was a bit more complicated than the rune of hatred, and it took him almost half an hour to perfect it. When he was finished, he imbued the gauntlet with divinity. It glowed softly, and he heard a skittering noise from behind him. A dozen rats were scurrying towards him, headed straight for the gauntlet. He picked up the other gauntlet. It was time to do a live test. He punched forwards with his left hand and watched as the rats jumped straight up, trying to get to the gauntlet. Punching with his other hand, he landed a hit directly on the largest rat. A nova of energy expanded outwards, killing 6 rats in a single go. The other 6 were heavily damaged by the attack and they fell to the ground. Jonathan quickly finished them off, noting that his rune of beckoning had run out of juice. Jonathan smiled at his new weapons and quickly analyzed them, interested to see if there was noticeable difference. Marauder Captain's Batterers. Tier 1 weapon, blunt. Twin dark iron gauntlets that are imbued with the spirit of a pugilist. These weapons are the perfect accompaniment to any martial path that eschews normal weaponry in favor of fighting in hand-to-hand combat. Using these weapons will even the gap, allowing you to fight against wielders of any other weapon. These gauntlets have been imbued with the power of Journeyman Smith, adding extra durability and offensive potential to their form. In addition, a runecrafter has enchanted the gauntlets with the runes of hatred and beckoning, creating a different effect for each gauntlet. The right one damages enemies, while the other pulls them in. +6 to strength, +6 to dexterity, +3 to resilience while wearing. There was no stat bonus, but Jonathan had not been expecting one either. The 2 gauntlets were more than enough for him now. Tie would be an interesting addition to his fighting style. As if by magic, the ground started to rumble, signifying the approach of the final beast wave. Jonathan quickly got up and started running toward the walls. It was time to see just how powerful his new weapons were. 10 minutes later, he was waiting on the top of the walls, having eschewed a bow this time. Nobody begrudged him of his decision either. They knew that he was saving his energy for the greater fight to come. Jonathan leaned over the wall and watched as the tide of monsters came hurtling across the ash, heading straight for the city. This was by far the largest group that he had seen yet, stretching for almost a mile in every direction. Behind it were a few large shapes that looked suspiciously like the ash mammoths from earlier. Jonathan smiled grimly. One of those monsters had almost taken him out last time. However, with all of his new bonuses, he was hoping that this fight would go a little bit differently. He unconsciously exuded a domineering aura of strength now, to the point that those around him looked visibly uncomfortable. The aura felt like that of a clenched fist, threatening extreme violence. As the monsters came into range, the defenders fired over the walls, sending their attacks into the ranks. This time, Jonathan extended his left hand over the wall, imbuing it with divinity. The gauntlet glowed with light, and a large portion of the enemy ranks broke off, heading straight towards him. They crashed into the wall, piling on top of each other in rabid desire. That rendered them easy targets for the attacks of the defenders, which quickly ripped through the tightly packed monsters. Jonathan withdrew his hand a moment later, satisfied with what he had seen. He made way for the other defenders, who quickly filled the gap, firing into the horde. A few of them shot him looks of suspicion, not knowing what he had just done. Jonathan knew that nobody understood runes, except for him, meaning that nobody would be able to discern the secret behind his power. That was just as well too. He was already powerful enough to put a target on his back. He didn't need another one. As the horde passed around the edges of the town, and broke against the walls, Jonathan began to prepare himself for the battle against the bosses. He would have to take out one of the monsters on his own if he was to help the town win this. Last time he had gotten an advantage over one of the creatures, and it had still almost killed him. If another ash mammoth came, he would need to be ready. Jonathan gathered his wits, and came up with a plan of action for how to best use his new weapons. He wasn't sure how well the rune of beckoning would work on the highly leveled mammoths, meaning that he was down to using the other one instead.